The foundations of what would eventually become the North Sea Empire emerged from the convergence of technological innovation, political opportunity, and the restless ambitions of Scandinavian seafarers during the 8th and 9th centuries. The transformation of Northern Europe's political landscape began not with grand imperial designs, but with the development of revolutionary maritime technology that would enable small groups of warriors to project power across vast distances of open water. The longship represented perhaps the most significant technological advancement in early medieval warfare and exploration. These vessels, typically measuring between 17 and 37 metres in length, featured shallow drafts of less than 1 metre, allowing them to navigate both open seas and inland rivers with equal facility. The clinker-built construction method, where overlapping planks were riveted together with iron bolts, created hulls that were both flexible enough to withstand ocean swells and sturdy enough to carry substantial loads of men and equipment. Archaeological evidence from ship burials at Gokstad and Oseberg reveals vessels capable of carrying between 30 and 70 warriors, along with their weapons, provisions, and portable wealth. The strategic advantages these ships provided cannot be overstated. Viking raiders could appear without warning along any coastline or riverbank, strike swiftly at undefended settlements, and vanish before local forces could mount effective resistance. The symmetrical design allowed crews to reverse direction instantly without turning the vessel around, while the shallow draft meant they could beach directly on shores or navigate far upstream into the heart of enemy territory. Danish and Norwegian shipwrights had perfected these designs by the early 9th century, creating the maritime equivalent of modern rapid deployment forces. Scandinavian society in this period was undergoing significant internal pressures that drove expansion overseas. Population growth, combined with limited arable land in Norway and Denmark, created competition for resources among the warrior elite. The practice of partible inheritance meant that younger sons often received minimal shares of family holdings, forcing them to seek wealth and status through alternative means. Raiding offered both immediate material rewards and the social prestige necessary to attract followers and establish independent power bases. The earliest recorded Viking attacks on England occurred in 793 AD with the assault on Lindisfarne Monastery, but these initial raids were relatively small-scale affairs focused on acquiring portable wealth. The situation changed dramatically in the mid-9th century, when Danish leaders began organising much larger expeditions with territorial ambitions. Among these figures, Ragnar Lothbrok emerged as a particularly significant catalyst for the expansion of Danish influence in Britain, though separating historical fact from later legendary embellishment remains challenging for modern scholars. Historical sources, primarily the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later Scandinavian sagas, describe Ragnar as leading substantial raids against both Francia and England during the 840s and 850s. While the exact details of his campaigns remain disputed, archaeological evidence and contemporary Frankish annals confirm that a leader named Ragnar conducted a devastating attack on Paris in 845 AD, extracting a massive tribute of 7,000 pounds of silver from Charles the Bald. This success demonstrated the vulnerability of even major continental powers to well-organised Viking expeditions and likely inspired further ambitious ventures. The transformation from raiding to conquest accelerated dramatically with the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in England during 865 AD. This force, described in contemporary sources as the largest Viking army ever assembled, represented a fundamental shift in Scandinavian strategy from hit-and-run tactics to systematic territorial conquest. Led by figures identified in later sources as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, this army numbered several thousand warriors and operated with unprecedented coordination and strategic planning. The composition of the Great Heathen Army reflected the evolving nature of Viking expeditions. Rather than consisting solely of Danish warriors, the force included fighters from across Scandinavia, along with seasoned veterans who had participated in earlier raids on Francia and Ireland. Many members brought their families, indicating long-term settlement intentions rather than temporary raiding objectives. The army's logistical capabilities were equally impressive, with a fleet of hundreds of ships providing mobility and supply lines that allowed them to operate independently of local resources for extended periods. The army's initial landing in East Anglia demonstrated their sophisticated approach to conquest. Rather than immediately launching attacks, they established a fortified base and extracted tribute from the local King Edmund, using these resources to provision their forces while gathering intelligence about political conditions throughout England. This methodical preparation reflected lessons learned from earlier expeditions and marked a departure from the impulsive raiding tactics that had characterised previous Viking activities. The systematic conquest of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began in earnest when the Great Heathen Army moved north into Northumbria in 866 AD. The kingdom was already weakened by internal civil war between rival claimants at Ael and Osbert, a situation the Vikings exploited with calculated precision. They captured York, the kingdom's principal city, and established it as their primary stronghold. When the feuding Northumbrian kings finally united to recapture their capital, the Vikings allowed them to approach the city walls before launching a devastating counterattack that killed both monarchs and effectively ended Northumbrian independence. The fall of York marked a crucial turning point in English history. The city, known to the Vikings as Jurvik, became the centre of Scandinavian power in northern England and remained under their control for nearly 2 centuries. Archaeological excavations in modern York have revealed extensive evidence of Viking settlement, including workshops, trading establishments, and residential areas that demonstrate the transformation of a Romano-British ecclesiastical centre into a thriving Scandinavian commercial hub. Following their Northumbrian triumph, the Great Heathen Army turned south toward Mercia, the most powerful remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. King Burgred of Mercia initially attempted to resist, but quickly recognised the futility of direct confrontation with such a formidable force. In 868 AD, he agreed to pay tribute and provide winter quarters for the Viking army, effectively acknowledging their dominance over his realm. This arrangement allowed the Vikings to consolidate their northern conquests while planning their next phase of expansion. The establishment of permanent Scandinavian settlements in conquered territories represented another crucial development during this period. Unlike earlier raiders who returned to Scandinavia with their plunder, members of the Great Heathen Army began claiming land for agricultural settlement. In 876 AD, Halfdan Ragnarsson formally divided territory in Northumbria among his followers, creating the first systematic Viking colonisation of English soil. Contemporary sources describe this land distribution in detail, noting that the Vikings shared out the land of the Northumbrians and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. This transition from conquest to settlement established patterns that would define Scandinavian influence in Britain for generations. Viking settlers adopted local agricultural practices while maintaining their distinct cultural identity, creating hybrid communities that blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Place-name evidence throughout northern and eastern England reveals the extent of this settlement, with hundreds of locations bearing distinctly Scandinavian names ending in by, Thorpe and Toft. The creation of the Danelaw formalised this territorial division and established the legal framework that would govern Scandinavian-controlled regions of England. The term itself, meaning the law of the Danes, referred both to the geographical area under Scandinavian control and to the distinct legal traditions that prevailed there. This legal system, derived from Scandinavian customary law, differed significantly from Anglo-Saxon legal practices in areas such as property rights, inheritance patterns, and criminal justice procedures. The boundaries of the Danelaw were established through a series of treaties between Viking leaders and the surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, most notably the agreement between Alfred the Great of Wessex and Guthrum of East Anglia around 886 AD. This treaty, preserved in multiple manuscript sources, defined a frontier running roughly along Watling Street, from London to Chester, with the territory to the north and east falling under Scandinavian jurisdiction. The agreement also included provisions for trade, legal procedures for disputes between Danes and Anglo-Saxons, and mutual recognition of territorial sovereignty. Within the Danelaw, Scandinavian settlers established numerous fortified centres known as burhs, which served both defensive and administrative functions. These settlements, including Lincoln, Stamford, Leicester, Derby and Nottingham, became known collectively as the Five Boroughs and formed the core of Danish political organisation in the English Midlands. Each borough controlled surrounding agricultural territory and maintained its own military forces, creating a decentralised system of governance that reflected traditional Scandinavian political structures. The social composition of Danelaw settlements revealed the complex nature of Viking colonisation. While warrior elites occupied the highest social positions and controlled the largest landholdings, the settler population included farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and labourers who had accompanied the military expeditions. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Torksey in Lincolnshire shows extensive evidence of metalworking, textile production, and trade activities that supported thriving mixed economies combining agriculture, craft production, and commerce. The integration of Scandinavian settlers with existing Anglo-Saxon populations varied significantly across different regions. In some areas, particularly in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, the density of Scandinavian settlement was sufficient to create predominantly Norse-speaking communities that maintained distinct cultural practices for several generations. In other regions, smaller numbers of Viking settlers were absorbed more quickly into existing social structures, though they often retained positions of local authority and influence. Religious practices within the Danelaw reflected this cultural complexity. While many Scandinavian settlers eventually converted to Christianity, the process was gradual and often incomplete. Archaeological evidence reveals the continued use of distinctly pagan burial practices well into the 10th century, while carved stone monuments from Yorkshire display fascinating combinations of Christian and Norse mythological imagery. The famous Gosforth Cross in Cumbria, for example, depicts scenes from both the Crucifixion and Ragnarok, demonstrating the syncretic religious culture that emerged in areas of intensive Scandinavian settlement. The economic impact of Scandinavian settlement extended far beyond the immediate territories of the Danelaw. Viking traders established commercial networks that connected Britain with markets throughout Scandinavia, the Baltic region, and even distant locations such as Constantinople and the Islamic world. Silver dirhams from the Middle East have been discovered in hoards throughout Viking-controlled England, while English coins appear in archaeological contexts across Scandinavia, demonstrating the extent of these trade connections. By the early 10th century, political fragmentation had become a defining characteristic of both England and Denmark, creating conditions that would eventually enable ambitious rulers to envision unifying these scattered territories under single authority. In England, the Danelaw had evolved into a collection of competing kingdoms and earldoms, each jealously guarding its independence while facing constant pressure from the expanding West Saxon kingdom to the south. The Danish settlers had adopted many aspects of Anglo-Saxon political culture, including the institution of kingship, but their territories remained politically fragmented and often engaged in conflicts with one another. The situation in Denmark was equally complex, with royal authority contested among multiple claimants and regional jarls, maintaining semi-independent control over their territories. The success of overseas expeditions had enriched many Danish leaders, but it had also created new sources of political competition as successful war leaders returned home with the resources and prestige necessary to challenge established authority. This internal instability would prove crucial in shaping the ambitions of future rulers who recognised that controlling both sides of the North Sea might offer greater security and prosperity than maintaining separate spheres of influence. The political fragmentation that characterised late 9th and early 10th century England and Denmark created the perfect conditions for an ambitious Danish ruler to exploit. Swene Forkbeard, son of Harold Bluetooth, emerged from this chaotic landscape with a clear understanding that sustained control over England required more than the seasonal raiding expeditions that had defined previous Danish interventions. His systematic approach to conquest would transform what had been opportunistic Viking raids into a coordinated imperial project spanning both sides of the North Sea. Sweyn's initial campaigns against England began in earnest around 991 AD, coinciding with a period of particular weakness in Anglo-Saxon defences. King Ethelred, who had earned the unfortunate epithet the Unready, had inherited a kingdom still struggling to integrate the formerly independent Danelaw territories with the expanding West Saxon state. The Battle of Maldon in 991 AD demonstrated the vulnerability of English forces to well-organised Danish attacks, as Ealdorman Beartnoth's Essex feared was decisively defeated by a Viking army that had landed on Northey Island in the Blackwater estuary. The tactical superiority displayed at Maldon reflected Sweyn's methodical approach to military organisation. Unlike the great heathen army of the previous century, which had operated as a loose confederation of warbands, Sweyn's forces demonstrated unprecedented discipline and coordination. Contemporary accounts describe Danish warriors arranged in tight shield wall formations, with spearmen in the front ranks supported by axe-wielding huscarls who could break through enemy lines at crucial moments. The Vikings' use of feigned retreats to draw English forces out of defensive positions showed sophisticated battlefield tactics that went far beyond the berserker charges of popular imagination. More importantly, the Battle of Maldon established a pattern that would define Anglo-Danish relations for the next 2 decades. Rather than attempting to hold territory immediately after military victories, Sweyn's strategy focused on extracting increasingly large tribute payments that simultaneously enriched his forces and weakened English resistance. The Dangeld payment of £10,000 of silver following Maldon represented just the beginning of a systematic economic warfare campaign that would drain England's resources while funding continued Danish military operations. Ethelred's response to these defeats revealed the fundamental weaknesses in late Anglo-Saxon governance that Sweyn would exploit throughout his conquest campaign. The English king's reliance on mercenary forces, including Danish warriors hired to fight against their own countrymen, created inherent instabilities in military planning and execution. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards buried during this period shows the extensive circulation of Scandinavian-style swords and axes throughout England, indicating that the distinction between Danish raiders and English defenders had become increasingly blurred. The tribute system established after Maldon created perverse incentives that accelerated English military decline. Local ealdormen found it easier to negotiate payments than to risk devastating battles against experienced Danish warriors, while the constant drain of silver to fund these tributes reduced resources available for maintaining fortifications and training militia forces. Contemporary chroniclers noted that some English nobles began to view Danish raids as manageable business expenses rather than existential threats to their authority. Sweyn's naval logistics capabilities provided the foundation for a sustained pressure campaign against England. Danish shipwrights had perfected techniques for constructing vessels capable of carrying not just warriors, but also horses, siege equipment, and provisions sufficient for extended operations. Archaeological analysis of ship remains from this period reveals vessels up to 30 metres in length, with cargo capacities exceeding 20 tons, allowing Danish forces to maintain operational independence for months without requiring local resupply. The strategic positioning of Danish bases along the English coast demonstrated Sweyn's understanding of the importance of secure supply lines and strategic mobility. Rather than attempting to hold fixed territories that could be besieged by English forces, Danish commanders established temporary fortifications on islands and peninsulas that could be easily defended while providing access to both inland targets and escape routes to the open sea. The Isle of Wight served as a particularly important staging area, offering access to both the wealthy monasteries of southern England and the commercial centres along the Thames estuary. Sweyn's systematic weakening of Anglo-Saxon resistance accelerated dramatically during the late 990s, as Danish raids became larger and more frequent. The chronicle entries for this period describe a relentless cycle of Danish attacks followed by increasingly desperate English attempts to buy peace through ever larger tribute payments. By 999 AD, the Danegeld had reached £24,000 of silver, representing an enormous drain on English resources that forced Ethelred to debase the currency and impose heavy taxes on his subjects. The psychological impact of these repeated defeats proved as damaging as the material losses. English chroniclers began to interpret Danish successes as divine punishment for moral failings, while the constant threat of attack disrupted agricultural production and commercial activity throughout southern England. Monasteries, which had served as centres of learning and economic activity since the 7th century, began relocating their treasures and manuscripts to more secure locations, fundamentally altering the cultural landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The St. Brice's Day massacre of November 13th, 1002, marked a crucial turning point that transformed the conflict from a series of raids and tribute payments into a total war for control of England. Ethelred's order to kill all Danes living in England represented a desperate attempt to eliminate what he perceived as a fifth column of potential collaborators and spies. The massacre, which contemporary sources describe as targeting Danish merchants, craftsmen, and even women and children who had been living peacefully in English communities for decades, demonstrated the complete breakdown of the diplomatic solutions that had previously contained the conflict. The execution of this genocidal order varied significantly across different regions of England. In areas with substantial Scandinavian populations, particularly in the former Danelaw territories, local officials often ignored or modified the king's commands, recognising that wholesale slaughter of their Danish neighbours would destroy established commercial and social relationships. However, in southern England, where Danish settlement had been less extensive, the massacre was carried out with brutal efficiency that shocked even contemporary observers, accustomed to the violence of the age. Among the victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre was Gunhilda, sister of Swyn Forkbeard, who had been living in England as part of a diplomatic marriage arrangement designed to strengthen Anglo-Danish relations. Her execution, along with her husband and children, provided Sweyn with both a personal motivation for revenge and a powerful propaganda tool for justifying total war against Ethelred's regime. Contemporary Danish sources describe Gunhilda's death in graphic detail, emphasising the violation of sacred hospitality laws and the targeting of innocent women and children. The massacre's immediate aftermath saw a dramatic escalation in Danish military activities as Swyn mobilised resources throughout his territories for a comprehensive invasion of England. Unlike previous campaigns that had relied primarily on seasonal raiding expeditions, Swyn's post-1002 strategy involved establishing permanent Danish bases on English soil and systematically destroying the infrastructure that supported Anglo-Saxon resistance. Danish forces began targeting not just wealthy monasteries and royal estates, but also the burhs and fortified towns that formed the backbone of English defensive strategy. The siege techniques employed by Danish forces during this intensified phase of the conflict demonstrated significant advances in military technology and organisation. Contemporary accounts describe Danish armies using sophisticated engineering methods to breach town walls, including the construction of siege towers and the systematic undermining of fortifications. The successful Danish assault on Exeter in 1003 AD involved the use of coordinated attacks from both land and sea, with Danish ships blocking river access, while ground forces maintained pressure on the city's landward defences. Sweyn's ability to maintain control over both his Danish territories and his expanding English conquests required unprecedented logistical coordination and administrative sophistication. The establishment of secure communication networks between Denmark and England involved the creation of relay stations on islands throughout the North Sea, where Danish ships could resupply and transfer messages between different theatres of operation. Archaeological evidence from sites such as the Shetland and Orkney Islands reveals extensive Danish military installations dating to this period, complete with weapons, storage facilities, and ship maintenance areas. The administrative challenges of governing conquered English territories while maintaining authority in Denmark forced Sweden to develop new forms of delegated authority that would later influence the structure of the North Sea Empire. Rather than attempting direct personal control over all conquered territories, Sweden appointed trusted lieutenants to serve as his representatives in different regions, granting them considerable autonomy in exchange for regular tribute payments and military support when required. This system allowed for rapid response to local challenges while maintaining overall strategic coordination under Sweden's ultimate authority. The economic integration of Danish and English territories under Sweden's control created new commercial opportunities that helped fund continued military operations. Danish merchants gained privileged access to English markets, while English craftsmen found new outlets for their products in Scandinavian territories. The standardization of weights and measures across Sweden's domains facilitated trade, while the establishment of secure trade routes protected by Danish naval forces encouraged commercial expansion that benefited both Danish and English populations in conquered territories. By 1013 AD, Sweden's systematic campaign had achieved its strategic objectives of isolating Ethelred's regime and establishing Danish control over most of England. The English king's flight to Normandy represented the culmination of more than 2 decades of military pressure that had progressively weakened Anglo-Saxon resistance, while strengthening Danish positions throughout the country. Contemporary sources describe Sweden's final campaign as more of a triumphal procession than a military conquest, with English nobles submitting voluntarily rather than risking the destruction that had befallen those who continued to resist. The speed of Ethelred's final collapse reflected the cumulative impact of Sweden's long-term strategy of systematic weakening rather than immediate conquest. English military forces had been so depleted by decades of tribute payments and repeated defeats that organised resistance had become virtually impossible. The defection of key English nobles, including Ealdorman Alfric of Hampshire and Archbishop Wulfstan of York, demonstrated that even the highest levels of Anglo-Saxon society had concluded that accommodation with Danish rule offered better prospects than continued resistance. Sweden's death at Gainsborough in February 1014, just months after achieving his goal of conquering England, created an immediate succession crisis that threatened to undo his achievements. The sudden loss of the unifying figure who had held together the diverse coalition of Danish, Norwegian, and English supporters left his empire vulnerable to fragmentation and reconquest. Ethelred's swift return from Norman exile, supported by English nobles who had never fully accepted Danish rule, demonstrated the fragility of conquest based primarily on military force without deeper institutional foundations. The brief restoration of Ethelred's authority in 1014 revealed both the limitations of Sweden's conquest and the enduring appeal of traditional Anglo-Saxon kingship among significant portions of the English population. However, the fundamental conditions that had enabled Sweden's original success remained unchanged, creating opportunities for his son Cnut to resume the imperial project with even greater resources and more sophisticated strategies for maintaining long-term control over the North Sea world. The death of Sweden Forkbeard in February 1014 created a power vacuum that his 18-year-old son Cnut was initially unprepared to fill, while the Danish fleet at Gainsborough immediately proclaimed him king. The young prince lacked both the military experience and political networks that had enabled his father's conquest of England. The swift return of Ethelred from Norman exile, accompanied by his son Edmund Ironside and a small force of Norman knights, caught the Danish leadership off guard and forced them into a hasty retreat across the North Sea. Cnut's first attempt at ruling England lasted barely 2 months, ending with his ignominious withdrawal to Denmark in April 1014 with little more than a handful of ships, and the bitter knowledge that conquest required more than hereditary claims. The year-long interregnum that followed Cnut's retreat provided him with crucial time to mature both as a military commander and political strategist. In Denmark, he worked systematically to consolidate support among the jarls and regional magnates who had served his father, while building new alliances with Norwegian and Swedish leaders who controlled significant naval resources. Archaeological evidence from Danish royal sites dating to this period shows extensive weapon production and ship construction, indicating that Cnut was preparing for a return expedition on a scale that would dwarf his father's previous efforts. The restoration of Ethelred's authority in England proved far more fragile than contemporary English chroniclers initially recognised. The king's advanced age and declining health, combined with the massive debts incurred during his Norman exile, severely limited his ability to rebuild the military infrastructure that Sweden had systematically destroyed. More critically, the English nobility had become deeply divided during the Danish occupation, with many former collaborators now facing suspicion and potential retribution from those who had remained loyal to the Anglo-Saxon cause. Edmund Ironside emerged during this period as the most capable military leader in the Anglo-Saxon camp, demonstrating tactical skills and personal courage that had been notably absent from English resistance during the previous decades. His successful defence of London against a Danish naval assault in late 1014 showed that effective resistance to Scandinavian invasion remained possible when English forces were properly led and adequately supplied. However, Edmund's growing influence created tensions with his father's established advisors, who viewed the young prince's aggressive military stance as potentially destabilising to the delicate political balance that had enabled Ethelred's restoration. Cnut's return to England in the summer of 1015 demonstrated the lessons he'd learned from his earlier failure. Rather than attempting to claim the throne immediately through military conquest, he established secure bases in Danish-friendly territories and began systematically building coalitions with English nobles who had grown disillusioned with Ethelred's restored regime. The Danish prince's diplomatic overtures were backed by substantial financial incentives, as he distributed silver freely among potential supporters, while promising to maintain existing property rights and local privileges for those who submitted voluntarily. The composition of Cnut's invasion force reflected his more sophisticated approach to conquest. While the core remained Danish and Norwegian warriors who'd served under Sweyn, the army also included significant numbers of Flemish and Frisian mercenaries, whose loyalty could be purchased and maintained through regular payments. More importantly, Cnut had recruited several prominent Anglo-Saxon exiles, who provided crucial intelligence about English defensive preparations and political conditions. These English collaborators, including Ealdorman Edric Striona of Mercia, brought with them detailed knowledge of local geography, fortification layouts, and the personal rivalries that could be exploited to divide English resistance. The strategic deployment of Danish forces across multiple landing sites along the English coast prevented Ethelred from concentrating his limited resources for effective defence. While the main Danish army established its primary base at Sandwich in Kent, smaller forces landed simultaneously in East Anglia, Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, forcing English commanders to divide their attention among multiple threats. This coordinated approach reflected Cnut's understanding that England's defensive strategy relied heavily on the ability to concentrate forces at threatened points, a capability that could be neutralised through simultaneous pressure at multiple locations. Edric Striona's defection to the Danish cause in early 1016 represented a catastrophic blow to Anglo-Saxon resistance that went far beyond the immediate military implications. As Ealdorman of Mercia, Edric controlled the largest and most strategically important English territory outside of Wessex itself, commanding resources and manpower that had been crucial to previous English defensive efforts. His betrayal brought with him not only the military forces of central England, but also detailed intelligence about English battle plans, supply routes, and the personal loyalties of other English nobles who might be persuaded to change sides. The psychological impact of Edric's treachery reverberated throughout the remaining English resistance, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that hampered military coordination. Edmund Ironside found himself constantly questioning the reliability of his subordinate commanders, while the rank-and-file soldiers began to doubt whether their leaders possessed the commitment necessary to sustain effective resistance against Danish forces. contemporary chroniclers noted that English military councils became consumed with debates about loyalty and trustworthiness rather than tactical planning, creating paralysis at precisely the moment when decisive action was most needed. Ethelred's death in April 1016 removed the last symbol of legitimate Anglo-Saxon authority that might have unified English resistance under a single command. While Edmund Ironside's succession was recognised by the remaining English nobles, his authority was contested from the beginning by those who favoured negotiated settlement with Cnut rather than continued military resistance. The new king's coronation ceremony, held hastily at St Paul's Cathedral with only a fraction of the traditional attendees, demonstrated the weakness of his position and the limited geographic extent of territories still under Anglo-Saxon control. Edmund's military campaigns during the summer of 1016 showed both his tactical competence and the fundamental limitations facing English resistance. His successful relief of the Siege of London demonstrated that Danish forces were not invincible when confronted by determined and well-led English troops fighting from prepared positions. The elaborate fortifications surrounding London, originally constructed during Alfred's reign and continuously improved over subsequent generations, provided defensive advantages that neutralised many of the tactical innovations that had given Danish forces superiority in open-field battles. The siege operations around London revealed the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Cnut had developed during his year of preparation in Denmark. Danish forces constructed extensive earthworks and wooden palisades that effectively sealed off the city from overland supply routes, while their control of the Thames below London Bridge prevented relief efforts by river. Archaeological excavations in the London area have uncovered remains of these Danish siege works, including evidence of specialised siege equipment such as mangonels and battering rams that represented significant advances over the relatively simple assault techniques employed during earlier Viking raids. Edmund's breakout from London and his subsequent campaign through Essex and Mercia demonstrated his understanding that static defence would ultimately fail against Danish numerical superiority and logistical advantages. His strategy of mobile warfare, striking at Danish supply lines and isolated detachments while avoiding major pitched battles, achieved several tactical successes that temporarily disrupted Cnut's systematic conquest of English territory. The English victory at Penselwood in Somerset showed that Danish forces could be defeated when caught at disadvantage, while Edmund's raid on Danish supply bases in East Anglia forced Cnut to divert significant resources to protect his logistical infrastructure. However, these tactical successes could not overcome the fundamental strategic imbalance between Danish and English resources. Cnut's ability to receive reinforcements and supplies from his Scandinavian territories meant that temporary setbacks could be quickly remedied, while Edmund's forces were gradually depleted through casualties and desertion without any prospect of replacement. The Danish control of most English ports and river mouths effectively isolated the remaining Anglo-Saxon territories from potential external assistance, creating a strategic situation that heavily favoured the invaders, despite occasional tactical reversals. The decisive confrontation between Edmund and Cnut came at Sandun in Essex on October 18th, 1016, where the fundamental differences in military organisation and tactical doctrine between Danish and English forces would determine the future of Anglo-Saxon England. Edmund had assembled the largest English army since the early stages of the Danish invasion, drawing troops from the surviving territories of Wessex, Kent, and parts of Mercia that remained under Anglo-Saxon control. Contemporary estimates suggest that Edmund commanded approximately 8,000 warriors, representing virtually every able-bodied man who could be mobilised from the remaining English territories. The English battle formation at Assendon reflected traditional Anglo-Saxon tactical doctrine, with heavily armoured thanes forming the front ranks of a shield wall, supported by feared militia armed with spears and axes. Edmund positioned his forces on rising ground that provided defensive advantages while limiting the mobility that had given Danish forces superiority in previous engagements. The English left flank was anchored on marshy ground that would prevent Danish cavalry from executing flanking manoeuvres, while the right was protected by a stream that channeled attacking forces into a narrow front where English numerical disadvantages would be minimised. Cnut's battle array demonstrated the tactical innovations that had made Danish forces so effective throughout the conquest campaign. The Danish centre consisted of professional huscarls arranged in tight wedge formations designed to punch through enemy shield walls at selected points, while the flanks were composed of more lightly armed warriors whose mobility allowed them to exploit gaps created by the central assault. Most importantly, Cnut had positioned Edric Streona's Mercian forces on the English right flank, where their sudden withdrawal at a crucial moment would create the tactical opportunity that decided the battle's outcome. The initial phases of the Battle of Asandun followed predictable patterns, with Danish assault columns advancing against the English shield wall, while English defenders maintained their positions and inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. Contemporary accounts describe fierce fighting that lasted several hours, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage through direct frontal assault. The English defensive position proved as effective as Edmund had hoped, with Danish forces suffering significant losses while making minimal progress against the well-positioned Anglo-Saxon line. The battle's decisive moment came when Edric Streona ordered his Mercian contingent to withdraw from the English right flank, creating a gap that Danish forces immediately exploited. The sudden collapse of English defences on the right allowed Danish warriors to attack the main English position from the flank and rear, transforming an orderly defensive battle into a chaotic rout. Edmund's attempts to rally his forces and restore the broken battle line were hampered by the confusion and panic that spread throughout the English ranks, as they found themselves surrounded and cut off from retreat routes. The slaughter that followed the collapse of English resistance at Asandun effectively ended organised Anglo-Saxon military opposition to Danish conquest. Contemporary chroniclers describe the battlefield as littered with the bodies of English nobles and thanes, including many of the most experienced military leaders who had survived the previous decades of Danish pressure. The death toll among the English nobility was so severe that entire regions were left without traditional leadership, creating administrative vacuums that Cnut would later fill with his own appointees. Edmund Ironside's escape from the Asandun battlefield with a small group of surviving followers demonstrated his personal courage, but could not disguise the completeness of his defeat. The remnants of English resistance that gathered around the fugitive king represented only a fraction of the forces that had been available at the battle's beginning, while the loss of so many experienced commanders meant that even these survivors lacked the leadership necessary for continued effective resistance. The partition agreement negotiated between Cnut and Edmund at Olney in late 1016 represented a pragmatic recognition of military realities, rather than a genuine diplomatic settlement. Edmund's acceptance of Danish control over most of England, retaining only Wessex south of the Thames for himself, reflected his understanding that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of the remaining Anglo-Saxon territories. The agreement's provisions for mutual recognition and peaceful coexistence were clearly intended as temporary expedients that would allow both sides to consolidate their positions while preparing for the inevitable resumption of hostilities. Edmund Ironside's death at Oxford on November 30th, 1016, just weeks after signing the partition agreement, removed the last obstacle to Cnut's undisputed control over all of England. While contemporary sources attribute Edmund's death to natural causes, the convenient timing and the immediate Danish occupation of Wessex that followed have led many historians to suspect assassination. Regardless of the specific cause, Edmund's death eliminated the final remnant of legitimate Anglo-Saxon royal authority and left Cnut as the sole ruler of a unified English kingdom for the first time since his father's brief reign 2 years earlier. Cnut's political acumen became immediately apparent in his handling of the transition from conquest to governance. Rather than attempting to rule England as a conquered territory through purely Danish institutions, he demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting existing Anglo-Saxon administrative structures to serve his imperial ambitions. His decision to marry Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, in 1017 represented a masterful stroke of diplomatic symbolism that simultaneously legitimised his rule in English eyes, while securing his northern flank against potential Norman intervention. The marriage alliance with Emma brought Cnut several crucial advantages beyond mere symbolic legitimacy. Emma's Norman connections provided diplomatic channels that could be used to prevent her brother Duke Richard from supporting future Anglo-Saxon restoration attempts, while her knowledge of English court politics and administrative procedures proved invaluable in establishing effective governance over the conquered territories. More importantly, the marriage demonstrated Cnut's understanding that successful imperial rule required the integration of conquered populations rather than their systematic exclusion from positions of authority and influence. The consolidation of Cnut's authority over England by 1017 provided him with the resources and strategic position necessary to pursue his father's broader imperial vision. However, the establishment of a true North Sea empire required control over Norway, the homeland of many of the most formidable seafaring warriors in medieval Europe. The death of Olaf Tryggvason at the Battle of Svolder in 1000 AD had left Norway fractured among competing regional jarls and petty kings, creating exactly the kind of political vacuum that ambitious Danish rulers had learned to exploit. Yet Norway's mountainous terrain, fierce warrior culture, and strategic position controlling access to the Baltic Sea made it a far more challenging conquest target than the relatively accessible English kingdoms. The succession crisis that followed Svolder had effectively partitioned Norway among three primary power centres, each representing different approaches to Scandinavian political organisation. Erik Håkonsson controlled the western coastal regions from Trondheim, maintaining the traditional jarl system that had governed Norway before the brief unification attempts of Harald Fairhair's descendants. His authority rested on personal loyalty networks and control of the most productive shipbuilding regions, making him the most formidable naval commander among the Norwegian contenders. Erik's alliance with Sween Forkbeard had been crucial to the Danish victory at Svolder, but his subsequent focus on Norwegian affairs had allowed him to maintain relative independence from Danish oversight during the English conquest campaigns. Svein Håkonsson, Erik's brother, had established control over the Trondelag region and the approaches to the important trading centre at Nidaros, modern Trondheim. His power base included many of the wealthy farming communities that provided both agricultural surplus and military manpower for Norwegian expeditions. Svein's political strategy emphasised traditional Norse religious practices and opposition to Christian conversion efforts, appealing to conservative elements within Norwegian society who viewed the adoption of foreign religious practices as a threat to established social hierarchies and cultural traditions. The third major power centre had emerged around the remnants of Olaf Tryggvason's Christian supporters, primarily concentrated in the southeastern regions around the Oslofjord. These territories maintained commercial connections with Danish and German markets, making them more receptive to European political and religious influences. The Christian faction lacked a single dominant leader following Olaf's death, but their control of trade routes and their potential for alliance with Danish Christian rulers made them an important factor in any attempt to reunify Norway under centralised authority. Into this fragmented political landscape came Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, whose return to Norway around 1015 represented a direct challenge to the delicate balance of power that had prevailed since Svolder. Olaf's background as a veteran of English campaigns under both Ethelred and Danish commanders provided him with extensive military experience and detailed knowledge of the tactical innovations that had made Scandinavian forces so effective against traditional defensive strategies. His conversion to Christianity during his service in England gave him potential allies among the Christian faction, while his royal bloodline as a descendant of Harald Fairhair provided legitimacy claims that could appeal to traditional Norwegian political sensibilities. Olaf Haraldsson's initial campaigns in southeastern Norway demonstrated both his military competence and his understanding of the religious and political currents that would determine his success or failure. Rather than attempting immediate confrontation with the established jarls, he focused on building a coalition of smaller landowners, urban merchants and Christian converts who had been marginalised under the traditional jarl system. His establishment of a royal court at Sarpsborg provided a symbolic alternative to the regional power centres controlled by the Håkonsson brothers. while his promotion of Christian religious practices offered a unifying ideology that transcended traditional tribal and regional loyalties. The religious dimension of Olaf's campaign proved particularly significant in distinguishing his movement from previous Norwegian unification attempts. His systematic destruction of pagan temples and sacred groves, combined with the construction of Christian churches in their place, represented a fundamental challenge to the traditional religious practices that underpinned existing political hierarchies. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Meire and Trondelag shows extensive destruction of pagan religious installations during this period, followed by the construction of Christian religious buildings that incorporated some traditional architectural elements while clearly establishing new religious priorities. Olaf's legal and administrative reforms demonstrated his intention to create a centralised Norwegian state modelled on European Christian kingdoms rather than traditional Scandinavian political structures. The establishment of a unified legal code known as the Gulating Law replaced the complex patchwork of regional legal traditions with standardised procedures that strengthened royal authority while providing consistent legal protections for all Norwegian subjects regardless of their regional origins. The new legal system included provisions for royal taxation, military service obligations, and judicial procedures that significantly expanded central government authority at the expense of traditional Jarl prerogatives. The economic implications of Olaf's reforms extended far beyond immediate political considerations, fundamentally altering the commercial relationships that had sustained Norwegian society for generations. His establishment of royal control over silver mining operations in the Kongsberg region provided independent revenue sources that reduced his dependence on traditional tribute relationships with regional jarls. The standardization of weights and measures throughout his territories facilitated trade while generating customs revenues that funded both military operations and administrative expansion. Cnut's initial response to Olaf Haraldsson's Norwegian campaigns reflected his preoccupation with consolidating English territories and establishing effective governance over his newly conquered kingdom. However, intelligence reports reaching the Danish court by 1018 made clear that Olaf's success in southeastern Norway posed a potential long-term threat to Danish interests throughout the North Sea region. A unified Norway under an independent Christian king could provide bases for raids against Danish territories, while Norwegian control of Baltic trade routes might undermine the commercial advantages that Cnut had gained through his English conquest. The diplomatic complexity of the Norwegian situation required Cnut to balance multiple competing interests while maintaining his primary focus on English affairs. Erik Håkonsson's previous alliance with Swene Forkbeard had been based on mutual benefit rather than subordination, making direct intervention in Norwegian affairs potentially costly and uncertain in its outcomes. However, allowing Olaf to achieve complete unification of Norway would create a powerful independent kingdom that might challenge Danish hegemony throughout Scandinavia. Cnut's solution involved a sophisticated diplomatic strategy that leveraged his growing influence with Swedish King Olof Skotkonung to create a coalition capable of containing Norwegian expansion without requiring massive Danish military commitment. The Swedish king's interests aligned with Danish concerns about Norwegian unification, as Olaf Haraldsson's control of trade routes through the Oslofjord threatened Swedish commercial access to Western European markets. More importantly, Olof Skotkonung's conversion to Christianity provided ideological common ground with Cnut, while creating potential religious conflicts with the still predominantly pagan populations in Swedish territories. The formal alliance between Cnut and Olof Skotkonung, negotiated through a series of diplomatic exchanges during 1019 and 1020, established the framework for coordinated action against Norwegian independence. The agreement included provisions for mutual military assistance, coordinated naval operations, and the division of any territories conquered from Norwegian forces. Most significantly, the alliance created a unified command structure that placed Swedish naval forces under overall Danish strategic direction, while allowing Swedish commanders to maintain tactical autonomy in operations within their traditional spheres of influence. The military preparations for the anti-Norwegian campaign demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that Cnut had developed during his English conquest. Danish shipyards worked throughout 1020 and 1021 to construct specialised vessels designed for operations in Norwegian fjords, where the shallow drafts and narrow channels that had given Vikings tactical advantages against their enemies now worked against Danish forces operating far from their home bases. These new ship designs incorporated lessons learned from English river operations, featuring reinforced hulls capable of withstanding rocky coastlines and specialised equipment for amphibious assault operations. Swedish contributions to the alliance included not only naval forces but also specialised knowledge of Baltic navigation routes and seasonal weather patterns that would be crucial for coordinating operations across the vast distances involved in Scandinavian warfare. Swedish commanders brought detailed intelligence about Norwegian defensive preparations, trade relationships, and political divisions that could be exploited during the campaign. Archaeological evidence from Swedish royal sites shows extensive weapon production and military preparation during this period, indicating that Olaf Skotkonung viewed the Norwegian campaign as a major strategic priority rather than a minor diplomatic obligation. The joint Danish-Swedish naval expedition that departed from Zealand in the spring of 1025 represented the largest coordinated military operation in Scandinavian history up to that point. The combined fleet included over 200 vessels carrying approximately 15,000 warriors, along with siege equipment, provisions and specialised personnel necessary for extended operations in hostile territory. The expedition's composition reflected the international character of Cnut's empire, with Danish and Swedish forces supplemented by English naval units, Flemish mercenaries and Norwegian exiles, who provided crucial local knowledge and political legitimacy for the invasion. The initial landings along the Norwegian coast achieved tactical surprise despite the massive scale of the operation. Olaf Haraldsson's intelligence network had detected Danish naval preparations, but the coordination with Swedish forces and the multiple simultaneous landing sites prevented effective Norwegian defensive concentration. Danish forces established secure beachheads at Sarpsborg and Tonsberg, while Swedish units landed further north near Hamar, creating multiple pressure points that divided Norwegian defensive resources. The siege of Sarpsborg in late 1025 demonstrated both the effectiveness of the Danish-Swedish alliance and the limitations of traditional Scandinavian siege warfare techniques. The town's wooden palisades and earthwork fortifications, adequate for defence against traditional Viking raids, proved vulnerable to the systematic siege methods that Cnut's forces had perfected during their English campaigns. Danish engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included covered approaches, battering rams, and elevated platforms for archers that systematically reduced the defenders' capabilities while minimising casualties among the attacking forces. Olaf Haraldsson's response to the invasion showed both his tactical competence and his understanding of the strategic disadvantages facing Norwegian resistance. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions against superior enemy numbers, he adopted a strategy of mobile defence that utilised Norway's difficult terrain to offset the invaders' advantages in numbers and equipment. His forces conducted systematic destruction of supplies and infrastructure in areas threatened by Danish-Swedish advance, while launching surprise attacks against isolated enemy detachments and supply convoys. The Battle of the Helgeir, fought along the river of the same name in early 1026, marked the decisive engagement that would determine the fate of Norwegian independence. Olaf had positioned his forces along the river's northern bank, using the water barrier to channel the Danish-Swedish attack into a narrow front, where Norwegian numerical disadvantages would be minimised. The battle site offered defensive advantages similar to those Edmund Ironside had exploited at earlier engagements, with marshy ground preventing cavalry operations and thick forest cover limiting the effectiveness of archery. Cnut's tactical approach at the Helgeir reflected lessons learned from previous Scandinavian battles, particularly the importance of preventing enemy forces from maintaining cohesive defensive formations. Rather than launching direct frontal assaults against prepared Norwegian positions, Danish commanders organised coordinated attacks from multiple directions, while Swedish forces attempted to cross the river upstream and attack the Norwegian position from the flank and rear. This complex tactical coordination required sophisticated communication systems and precise timing that demonstrated the high level of military organisation that the alliance had achieved. The Norwegian defensive position along the Helgea proved more formidable than Danish intelligence had anticipated, with Olaf's forces demonstrating tactical innovations that reflected their experience in English campaigns. Norwegian warriors had adopted the shield wall formations that had proven effective against Viking attacks, while incorporating specialised anti-cavalry tactics learned during service under various English commanders. The Norwegian use of coordinated spear formations and strategic positioning of archers in elevated positions created defensive capabilities that significantly exceeded traditional Scandinavian military doctrine. The battle's turning point came when Swedish forces successfully established a bridgehead across the river, upstream from the main Norwegian position, threatening to surround Olaf's army and cut off their retreat routes. The Norwegian king's attempts to reposition his forces to meet this flanking threat created gaps in his main defensive line that Danish forces immediately exploited. The subsequent collapse of Norwegian resistance followed the pattern established at previous decisive battles, with initial tactical success giving way to complete rout once defensive cohesion was broken. Olaf Haraldsson's escape from the Helgea battlefield with a small group of loyal followers marked the effective end of Norwegian resistance to the Danish-Swedish alliance. The king's flight to Kievan Rus, where he sought refuge at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, removed the primary symbol of Norwegian independence while leaving his former territories without effective leadership or coordination. The scattered Norwegian nobles who had survived the battle found themselves facing the choice between submission to the victorious alliance or continued resistance without realistic prospects for success. The formal submission of Norwegian territories to Cnut's overlordship during the summer of 1026 established the legal and political framework that would define the North Sea Empire for the remainder of his reign. Rather than attempting direct annexation of Norwegian territories, Cnut adopted a sophisticated approach that maintained existing local administrative structures while ensuring ultimate Danish control over strategic decisions. Norwegian jarls who submitted voluntarily were allowed to retain their traditional authority over local affairs, while those who continued resistance were replaced by Danish or pro-Danish appointees. The administrative integration of Norway into Cnut's expanding empire required unprecedented coordination across vast geographical distances and diverse political traditions. The establishment of regular communication networks between Denmark, England and Norway involved the creation of relay stations and supply depots that could support royal messengers and administrative personnel travelling between different parts of the empire. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Scandinavia shows extensive construction of royal administrative buildings during this period, indicating the massive bureaucratic expansion necessary to govern such diverse territories. The economic implications of Norwegian integration extended far beyond immediate political considerations, fundamentally altering trade relationships throughout northern Europe. Cnut's control of Norwegian timber resources, iron production, and amber trade routes provided new revenue sources while strengthening his empire's economic independence from potential rivals. The standardization of currency and commercial regulations across Danish, English, and Norwegian territories created the largest unified market in medieval Europe, facilitating trade and generating customs revenues that funded continued imperial expansion. By 1028, Cnut's formal establishment of the North Sea Empire encompassing England, Denmark, Norway and parts of Sweden represented the culmination of nearly 3 decades of systematic expansion that had begun with his father's initial raids on English territory. The empire's geographical extent, stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the Baltic Sea and from the Irish Sea to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, created unprecedented opportunities for commercial and cultural exchange, while establishing Cnut as the most powerful ruler in northern Europe. The administrative sophistication necessary to govern such diverse territories had required innovations in communication, taxation, and military organisation that would influence European political development for generations to come. The establishment of effective governance over the vast territories of the North Sea Empire presented Cnut with administrative challenges that no previous medieval ruler had faced. The empire's geographical extent, stretching from the Orkney Islands to the Danish peninsula and from the Irish Sea to the Baltic coast, encompassed populations speaking different languages, following distinct legal traditions and maintaining separate cultural identities that had developed over centuries of independent political development. The successful integration of these diverse territories required administrative innovations that balanced the practical necessity of centralised royal authority with the political wisdom of respecting established local customs and institutions. Cnut's approach to imperial administration reflected his understanding that sustainable governance required more than military conquest and tribute extraction. His experiences during the chaotic transition following his father's death had demonstrated the fragility of authority, based solely on personal loyalty and military force. The young king recognised that lasting imperial control demanded the creation of institutional structures that could function effectively regardless of the personal qualities or immediate presence of individual rulers. This insight led to the development of administrative systems that combined Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon, and continental European governmental practices into a sophisticated hybrid that could accommodate the empire's diverse political traditions. The foundation of Cnut's administrative system rested on a carefully calibrated division of authority between royal appointees and established local elites. In England, where Anglo-Saxon governmental traditions were highly developed, Cnut retained the existing structure of shires and hundreds, while ensuring that key positions were filled by individuals whose loyalty to the Danish crown was beyond question. The appointment of Danish jarls as earls over major English territories such as Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia provided direct royal control over military and judicial affairs, while allowing Anglo-Saxon reeves and local officials to continue managing routine administrative functions at the village and hundred level. The integration of Danish administrative personnel into English governmental structures required extensive training programs that familiarised Scandinavian nobles with Anglo-Saxon legal procedures, record-keeping systems, and taxation methods. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Winchester and York reveals the construction of specialised administrative buildings during Cnut's reign, complete with scriptoriums for document production and secure storage facilities for royal archives. These installations demonstrate the bureaucratic sophistication that imperial governance required, with teams of scribes, translators, and legal experts working to maintain communication and coordination across the empire's vast distances. In Denmark, Cnut faced the different challenge of strengthening royal authority over traditional jarls who had maintained semi-independent control over their territories for generations. The Danish political system had historically emphasised personal relationships and reciprocal obligations between kings and regional magnates, making direct royal administration more difficult to implement than in England's more centralised governmental structure. Cnut's solution involved the gradual expansion of royal administrative presence through the establishment of permanent royal residences in key Danish territories, each staffed with household officials who could monitor local conditions and ensure compliance with imperial policies. The creation of a unified legal framework across the empire represented one of Cnut's most significant administrative achievements. The diverse legal traditions that prevailed in different parts of the empire had developed independently over centuries, creating complex jurisdictional problems when disputes arose between subjects from different territories or when imperial policies conflicted with established local practices. Cnut's legal reforms addressed these challenges through the systematic codification of existing laws and the careful integration of different legal traditions into comprehensive codes that could be applied consistently throughout the empire. The famous law codes issued under Cnut's authority demonstrate sophisticated legal thinking that balanced respect for established customs with the practical requirements of imperial governance. The laws concerning Danish settlers in England, for example, preserve traditional Scandinavian inheritance practices and dispute resolution procedures while ensuring that these customs operated within the broader framework of royal justice. Similarly, the provisions governing English merchants operating in Danish territory protected established commercial practices while subjecting them to imperial taxation and regulation that generated revenue for the royal treasury. Church-state relations required particularly delicate handling given the religious diversity that characterised different parts of the empire. In England, where Christianity had been established for centuries and where ecclesiastical institutions played crucial roles in education, record-keeping and local administration, Cnut positioned himself as a protector of church rights and privileges. His generous donations to English monasteries and his support for ecclesiastical reform movements demonstrated his understanding that effective governance required cooperation with established religious authorities who commanded significant popular loyalty and possessed extensive administrative capabilities. The integration of Christian and traditional Scandinavian religious practices in Denmark and Norway presented more complex challenges that required careful diplomatic manoeuvring. Many Danish and Norwegian nobles remained attached to traditional religious practices that were deeply embedded in existing social hierarchies and political relationships. Cnut's approach involved gradual encouragement of Christian conversion through personal example and material incentives, rather than forced conversion that might provoke resistance and political instability. Archaeological evidence from Danish royal sites shows the construction of Christian chapels alongside traditional halls, indicating the syncretic religious culture that characterised the imperial court during this period. Economic policy formation represented another area where Cnut's administration demonstrated remarkable sophistication in balancing competing interests and diverse economic systems. The empire's territories included regions with fundamentally different economic structures, from the agricultural estates and market towns that dominated English economic life to the pastoral and maritime economies that prevailed in much of Scandinavia. The successful integration of these diverse economic systems required policies that could accommodate different production methods and commercial practices while generating sufficient revenue to support imperial administration and military forces. The standardization of currency systems across the empire represented a major achievement in medieval economic integration. Prior to Cnut's reign, England, Denmark and Norway had maintained separate monetary systems with different weight standards, silver content and design traditions that complicated commercial transactions and made systematic taxation difficult to implement. Cnut's monetary reforms established unified standards that facilitated trade while ensuring that royal control over currency production provided reliable revenue sources and powerful symbols of imperial authority. The new imperial coinage featured sophisticated designs that combined traditional Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon symbolic elements with Christian imagery that reflected Cnut's religious policies. Archaeological analysis of coins from this period reveals remarkably consistent weight and silver content across different minting locations, indicating the high level of administrative coordination that imperial monetary policy achieved. The widespread circulation of these standardized coins throughout the empire's territories demonstrates the effectiveness of the new monetary system in facilitating commercial activity and reinforcing imperial political unity. Trade policy development required careful attention to the diverse commercial relationships that connected different parts of the empire with external markets. English territories had traditionally maintained extensive commercial connections with Flemish and French markets, while Danish and Norwegian regions were more closely integrated with Baltic and Germanic trading networks. Imperial trade policies needed to protect and enhance these existing relationships while creating new commercial opportunities that could generate additional revenue and strengthen political ties between different parts of the empire. The establishment of imperial trading privileges and standardized commercial regulations created unprecedented opportunities for merchants who could operate across the entire North Sea region without encountering the complex array of local taxes, customs duties and regulatory restrictions that had previously fragmented Northern European commerce. royal protection for merchant vessels and the establishment of secure harbours and warehouses in major ports encouraged commercial expansion that benefited both private traders and the imperial treasury through customs revenues and licensing fees. Military organisation represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of imperial administration, as the empire's survival depended on maintaining effective defensive capabilities across vast geographical distances while deterring potential challenges from internal rebels or external enemies. The diverse military traditions that prevailed in different parts of the empire created both opportunities and challenges for imperial military planners who needed to integrate various fighting styles and organisational structures into coherent defensive systems. The establishment of the housecarls as an elite imperial guard represented Cnut's most innovative military reform. These professional warriors, recruited from throughout the empire and maintained at royal expense, provided a mobile strategic reserve that could respond rapidly to threats in any part of the imperial territories. Unlike traditional feared levies or regional militias that were tied to specific localities and available only for limited periods, the housecarls served as full-time soldiers whose primary loyalty was to the imperial crown, rather than to regional magnates or local communities. The housecarls' training regimen reflected the military lessons learned during the conquest campaigns, with emphasis on coordinated tactics, siege warfare techniques, and amphibious operations that could be employed effectively across the empire's diverse geographical conditions. Archaeological evidence from royal military installations shows specialised training facilities and weapon storage areas that supported these elite units, while documentary sources describe elaborate ceremonies and oath-taking rituals that reinforced their loyalty to imperial authority. Naval administration required unprecedented coordination given the empire's dependence on maritime communications and the constant threat of seaborne attacks from potential enemies. The maintenance of royal fleets capable of operating effectively in the North Sea, Baltic Sea, and Atlantic coastal waters demanded sophisticated logistical support systems that could provide ships, crews, and supplies across vast distances and diverse operational environments. The establishment of permanent naval bases at strategic locations such as London, Copenhagen, and Trondheim created the infrastructure necessary to support these naval operations, while providing secure harbours for merchant vessels that generated commercial revenue. The standardisation of ship construction techniques and naval operational procedures across different parts of the empire ensured that vessels and crews from various territories could operate together effectively during major campaigns or emergency responses. Royal shipyards established during Cnut's reign incorporated the best design features from different regional traditions, creating vessels that combine the speed and manoeuvrability of traditional Scandinavian longships with the cargo capacity and seaworthiness necessary for extended operations in diverse maritime conditions. The administrative challenges of coordinating military and naval operations across such vast distances required communication systems that could transmit orders and intelligence rapidly and reliably throughout the empire. The establishment of signal stations and messenger relay points created networks that enabled royal commanders to maintain strategic coordination while allowing local commanders sufficient tactical flexibility to respond effectively to immediate threats and opportunities. The administrative sophistication that enabled Cnut's governance of the North Sea Empire created the foundation for an equally remarkable transformation in religious and cultural practices throughout his territories. By 1020, the young king had recognised that sustainable imperial authority required more than effective bureaucracy and military coordination. It demanded the cultivation of shared values and beliefs that could unite diverse populations under a common imperial identity. This realisation led to one of the most significant religious conversion movements in medieval European history, as Cnut embraced Christianity not merely as a personal faith, but as a unifying ideology capable of binding together the disparate territories of his empire. Cnut's conversion to Christianity represented a calculated political decision informed by his observations of religious dynamics throughout his territories. In England, where Christian institutions had provided crucial administrative support for Anglo-Saxon kings, and where ecclesiastical networks facilitated communication and coordination across vast distances, the practical advantages of Christian governance were immediately apparent. English monasteries served as centres of literacy, record-keeping and education that made sophisticated administration possible, while bishops and abbots commanded popular respect and loyalty that secular officials often struggled to achieve. The extensive landholdings controlled by English churches generated substantial revenue through agricultural production and commercial activities, while their exemption from certain royal taxes was more than offset by their voluntary contributions to royal projects and their provision of essential governmental services. The Danish religious landscape presented different opportunities and challenges for a Christian ruler. Traditional Scandinavian religious practices remained deeply embedded in social hierarchies and political relationships, with many Danish nobles viewing their authority as deriving from ancient religious traditions that connected them to legendary ancestors and divine powers. However, the increasing commercial and diplomatic contacts with Christian European kingdoms had exposed Danish elites to alternative religious and political models that offered potential advantages for ambitious rulers. The courts of the Holy Roman Emperor and the French king provided examples of how Christian monarchy could enhance royal authority while creating opportunities for advantageous alliances with other Christian rulers. Norwegian religious conditions were particularly complex due to the recent conflicts between Christian and pagan factions that had characterised Olaf Tryggvason's reign and the subsequent civil wars. Many Norwegian nobles associated Christianity with political centralisation and royal authority that threatened traditional regional autonomy, while others viewed Christian conversion as necessary for full participation in European diplomatic and commercial networks. The destruction of pagan temples during Olaf Haraldsson's campaigns had created religious vacuums in many areas that could be filled either by restored traditional practices or by systematic Christian evangelization supported by royal authority. Cnut's approach to Christian conversion demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to these diverse religious conditions throughout his empire. Rather than attempting immediate and comprehensive religious transformation that might provoke resistance and political instability, he adopted a gradual strategy that emphasized personal example, material incentives, and the practical advantages of Christian religious practices. His marriage to Emma of Normandy had provided him with direct connections to established Christian royal courts, while his extensive contacts with English ecclesiastical leaders had educated him about the administrative and cultural benefits that Christian institutions could provide for imperial governance. The king's personal religious practices became increasingly conspicuous as he sought to demonstrate his commitment to Christian principles, while maintaining respect for the religious sensibilities of his non-Christian subjects. Contemporary chroniclers describe elaborate royal religious ceremonies at major Christian festivals, with Cnut participating in liturgical celebrations that emphasized his role as a Christian monarch chosen by divine providence to rule over his territories. These public displays of piety served multiple political functions, reassuring Christian subjects of royal support for their religious practices, while demonstrating to potential pagan converts the social and political advantages that Christian conversion might provide. Cnut's patronage of church construction projects throughout his territories provided tangible evidence of his commitment to Christian religious development, while creating employment opportunities and economic stimulus that benefited local populations regardless of their personal religious beliefs. The construction of new churches and the expansion of existing religious buildings required skilled craftsmen, labourers, and suppliers whose work generated economic activity that extended far beyond the immediate religious communities being served. Archaeological evidence from church construction sites dating to Cnut's reign reveals sophisticated building techniques and decorative programs that incorporated both traditional Scandinavian artistic elements and contemporary European Christian architectural styles. The royal patronage of manuscript illumination and religious art represented another crucial aspect of Cnut's cultural transformation program. The The production of illuminated religious texts required extensive resources and specialised skills that could only be sustained through substantial financial support from wealthy patrons. Cnut's commissioning of elaborate gospel books, psalters, and other religious manuscripts served multiple purposes beyond their immediate liturgical functions. These magnificent volumes demonstrated the cultural sophistication and artistic capabilities of Christian religious communities, while their distribution to churches throughout the empire helped standardize religious practices and reinforce imperial political unity through shared religious observances. The artistic programs developed in these royal manuscripts reveal fascinating combinations of Scandinavian decorative traditions with Christian iconographic themes. Illuminators working under royal patronage incorporated traditional Norse artistic motifs, such as interlaced animal designs and geometric patterns into Christian religious contexts, creating hybrid artistic styles that appeal to audiences familiar with both cultural traditions. The famous Cnut Psalter, produced around 1025, features elaborate initial letters decorated with serpentine creatures that recall traditional Scandinavian metalwork designs, while framing Christian religious texts in Latin and Old English translations. The establishment of cathedral schools and monastic educational institutions throughout the empire represented one of Cnut's most significant long-term contributions to cultural development. These educational centres provided training not only in religious subjects, but also in practical skills such as reading, writing, mathematics, and legal procedures that were essential for effective participation in imperial administration. The curriculum developed at these schools combined traditional Christian educational elements with practical training in languages, legal procedures, and administrative techniques that prepared students for careers in royal service while ensuring their familiarity with Christian religious principles. The recruitment of Anglo-Saxon missionaries and scholars for evangelization work throughout Scandinavian territories demonstrated Cnut's understanding that successful religious conversion required cultural sensitivity and linguistic competence that foreign missionaries often lacked. English religious personnel possessed crucial advantages for work in Scandinavian contexts, including familiarity with Germanic linguistic structures that facilitated learning Old Norse and Danish, experience with the gradual conversion processes that had characterized English Christian development, and knowledge of administrative and legal procedures that could be adapted to Scandinavian political conditions. These Anglo-Saxon missionaries brought with them sophisticated theological training and pastoral experience that enabled them to address the intellectual and spiritual concerns of potential Scandinavian converts, while respecting local cultural traditions that did not conflict with essential Christian principles. Their work involved not only formal religious instruction, but also the development of Christian religious literature in vernacular languages that made complex theological concepts accessible to populations with limited Latin literacy. The translation of biblical texts, liturgical materials, and religious instruction manuals into Old Norse and Danish created the literary foundation necessary for sustainable Christian religious development throughout Scandinavian territories. The gradual transformation of Viking warrior culture into Christian medieval monarchy required careful attention to the military traditions and social values that had defined Scandinavian society for generations. The warrior ethos that emphasized personal courage, loyalty to leaders, and the pursuit of glory through military achievement had provided the cultural foundation for the expansion that created Cnut's empire. But these same values could potentially conflict with Christian teachings about peace, humility, and spiritual rather than worldly achievement. The successful integration of these different value systems required sophisticated cultural adaptation that preserved essential elements of traditional warrior culture while redirecting them toward Christian purposes and imperial political objectives. Cnut's development of the House Carls as an elite Christian warrior brotherhood provided an innovative solution to this cultural challenge. These professional soldiers took religious oaths that combined traditional warrior loyalty pledges with Christian religious commitments, creating a hybrid military culture that maintained the martial effectiveness of traditional Scandinavian warriors while incorporating Christian moral principles and religious practices. The housecarls participated in regular religious observances and received instruction in Christian moral theology alongside their military training, creating a warrior elite whose personal identity combined martial prowess with religious devotion. The ceremonial aspects of housecarl service reflected this cultural synthesis through elaborate rituals that incorporated both military and religious elements. New recruits underwent initiation ceremonies that included both traditional warrior oath-taking and Christian religious vows, while their weapons and equipment were blessed by Christian clergy using liturgical procedures that emphasized their role as defenders of Christian faith and imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from royal military installations shows chapel buildings constructed adjacent to training facilities and barracks, indicating the integration of religious observance into daily military routine. The transformation of traditional Scandinavian royal courts into Christian medieval institutions required extensive changes in ceremonial protocols, architectural arrangements, and social hierarchies that had developed over centuries of pre-Christian political evolution. Traditional Norse royal halls had been designed to accommodate religious ceremonies honouring pagan deities, with architectural features such as high seats, ceremonial fire pits, and decorative programs that reflected traditional religious symbolism. The adaptation of these spaces for Christian royal ceremonies required creative architectural solutions that maintained the grandeur and symbolic authority of traditional royal spaces, while incorporating Christian religious elements and ceremonial requirements. Royal chapel construction within existing palace complexes represented one approach to this architectural challenge. These Christian religious spaces were designed to complement rather than replace traditional ceremonial halls, creating palace complexes that could accommodate both Christian religious observances and secular royal ceremonies that maintained connections to traditional political culture. The chapel at Roskilde, constructed during Cnut's reign, exemplifies this architectural approach with its sophisticated stone construction and elaborate decorative program that incorporated both Christian religious imagery and traditional Scandinavian artistic motifs. The development of Christian royal ceremonial protocols required extensive consultation with ecclesiastical advisors who possessed expertise in European Christian royal traditions, while understanding the political and cultural sensitivities that characterize Scandinavian royal courts. These ceremonial innovations needed to demonstrate Cnut's status as a legitimate Christian monarch comparable to other European rulers, while maintaining the personal accessibility and martial character that Scandinavian political traditions demanded from their kings. The resulting ceremonial synthesis created new forms of Christian royal ritual that would influence Scandinavian political culture for centuries. The economic implications of religious transformation extended throughout imperial society as Christian institutions assumed increasing responsibility for education, healthcare, and social welfare services that had previously been provided through traditional kinship networks and local community organisations. Monastic communities established hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions that served populations regardless of their religious affiliations, while demonstrating the practical benefits that Christian religious institutions could provide for imperial subjects. These social services required substantial financial support that was provided through royal grants, noble donations, and income from ecclesiastical landholdings that made Christian institutions major economic forces throughout the empire. The integration of Christian religious festivals and observances into imperial political culture created new opportunities for demonstrating royal authority and imperial unity, while providing shared cultural experiences that transcended regional and ethnic divisions within the empire. Major Christian holidays such as Easter and Christmas became occasions for elaborate royal ceremonies that brought together nobles and officials from throughout the empire, creating regular opportunities for political consultation and cultural exchange that strengthened imperial cohesion. These religious celebrations incorporated traditional Scandinavian elements, such as elaborate feasting and gift-giving that maintained connections to established cultural practices while directing them toward Christian purposes. The transformation of traditional Scandinavian artistic traditions through Christian patronage and religious themes created new forms of cultural expression that reflected the hybrid identity emerging throughout the empire. Metalworkers, woodcarvers, and textile artisans adapted their traditional techniques and decorative motifs to Christian religious subjects, creating distinctive artistic styles that combined Scandinavian technical excellence with Christian iconographic programs. Church furnishings such as altars, crosses, and liturgical vessels produced during this period demonstrate remarkable artistic sophistication that rivaled contemporary productions from established European Christian artistic centres. The development of vernacular Christian literature in Scandinavian languages represented another crucial aspect of cultural transformation that made Christian religious concepts accessible to populations with limited Latin literacy while preserving important elements of traditional oral literary culture. Christian poets and scholars working under royal patronage created new literary forms that adapted traditional Scandinavian poetic techniques to Christian religious themes, producing works such as religious poems that used traditional alliterative verse structures to convey biblical narratives and theological concepts. These literary innovations created cultural bridges that facilitated religious conversion while maintaining connections to valued traditional artistic forms. The cultural and religious transformation that characterised Cnut's empire created the necessary foundation for unprecedented economic integration across the North Sea region. By 1025, the standardisation of legal codes, monetary systems, and administrative practices had removed many of the barriers that had previously fragmented Northern European commerce. However, the full realisation of the empire's economic potential required the systematic development of trade networks that could connect the diverse productive capabilities of English, Danish, and Norwegian territories into a coherent commercial system capable of competing with established Mediterranean and continental European trading networks. The geographical advantages of Cnut's empire for maritime commerce were immediately apparent to contemporary observers. English territories produced high-quality wool that was increasingly sought after in Flemish textile centres, while Scandinavian regions controlled access to timber, iron, amber, and furs that were essential commodities for European markets. The empire's extensive coastlines and numerous natural harbours provided ideal conditions for maritime commerce, while the political unity that Cnut had achieved eliminated the piracy and territorial conflicts that had previously made North Sea shipping dangerous and unpredictable. The development of systematic trade routes connecting these diverse regional economies required substantial investments in harbour facilities, warehouse construction, and navigational infrastructure that only imperial resources could provide. Archaeological excavations at major ports such as London, Winchester, Roskilde, and Trondheim reveal extensive construction projects during Cnut's reign that transformed these settlements from regional market centres into international commercial hubs capable of handling the increased trade volumes that imperial integration made possible. The London waterfront in particular underwent massive expansion during this period, with new quays, warehouses, and administrative buildings that could accommodate the larger vessels and more complex commercial transactions that characterised imperial trade networks. The timber trade represented one of the most significant commercial developments within the empire, as English demand for high-quality Scandinavian wood created opportunities for systematic exploitation of Norwegian and Danish forest resources. English construction projects, including the numerous church buildings sponsored by royal and noble patrons, required substantial quantities of oak, pine, and other woods that were either unavailable or of inferior quality in English forests. The establishment of regular shipping routes between Scandinavian timber-producing regions and English construction centres created employment opportunities for woodcutters, shipbuilders, and transport workers throughout the empire, while generating customs revenues that supported imperial administration. The sophisticated logistics required for timber transportation led to innovations in ship design and cargo handling that influenced maritime technology throughout northern Europe. Specialised timber-carrying vessels developed during this period featured reinforced hulls and modified cargo spaces that could accommodate the long planks and heavy beams required for major construction projects. These ships incorporated design elements from both Scandinavian longship traditions and English cargo vessel construction, creating hybrid designs that combined the seaworthiness necessary for North Sea navigation with the cargo capacity required for profitable commercial operations. English wool production experienced dramatic expansion during Cnut's reign, as imperial trade networks provided access to continental markets that had previously been difficult to reach through existing commercial channels. The empire's political stability and standardised commercial regulations made English wool increasingly attractive to Flemish textile manufacturers who required reliable supplies of consistent quality materials for their expanding production operations. Archaeological evidence from English sheep-raising regions shows substantial investments in improved pasture management and breeding programs during this period, indicating the systematic development of wool production capabilities that could meet growing international demand. The establishment of wool grading and quality control systems throughout English territories ensured that exported products met the exacting standards demanded by continental textile manufacturers, while protecting the reputation of English wool in international markets. Royal inspectors supervised the sorting and packaging of wool shipments, while standardised marking systems identified the regional origins and quality grades of different products. These quality control measures, unprecedented in medieval European commerce, helped establish English wool as a premium product that commanded higher prices than competing materials from other regions. The integration of Scandinavian amber and fur trades into imperial commercial networks created new opportunities for connecting northern European markets with more distant trading systems that extended into Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Danish and Norwegian merchants had traditionally maintained trading relationships with Baltic and Russian territories through established river routes and seasonal trading expeditions, but imperial political unity enabled the systematic coordination of these activities with English commercial networks and continental European markets. The amber trade proved particularly lucrative as imperial merchants gained preferential access to Baltic amber deposits, while benefiting from standardised imperial currency systems that facilitated complex international transactions. Amber jewellery and decorative objects produced in imperial workshops combined traditional Scandinavian craftsmanship with Christian religious themes that appeal to European Christian markets, while the standardised weights and measures used throughout the empire simplified commercial negotiations and reduced transaction costs that had previously limited trade volumes. Cnut's monetary policies represented perhaps his most significant contribution to economic integration, as the establishment of unified currency systems eliminated the complex exchange calculations and verification procedures that had previously complicated commercial transactions between different parts of the empire. The new imperial coinage featured consistent silver content and weight standards that were maintained through sophisticated quality control procedures implemented at royal mints throughout the empire. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate testing procedures that ensured the purity and weight accuracy of imperial coins, while severe penalties for counterfeiting or currency manipulation protected the integrity of the monetary system. The artistic programs featured on imperial coins served important commercial functions beyond their obvious political symbolism. The consistent design elements that appeared on coins minted in different parts of the empire helped merchants and consumers identify authentic imperial currency, while distinguishing it from potentially debased or counterfeit coins that might be circulating in international markets. The use of Christian religious imagery on imperial coins also facilitated their acceptance in European Christian markets, where religious symbolism carried significant commercial and cultural weight. The technical sophistication of imperial minting operations reflected the high level of administrative coordination that economic integration required. Royal mints established during Cnut's reign incorporated advanced metallurgical techniques that ensured consistent silver content across different production facilities, while standardized die-cutting procedures created uniform coin designs that could be easily recognised and verified by merchants throughout the empire. Archaeological analysis of coins from this period reveals remarkably consistent production standards that demonstrate the effectiveness of imperial quality control systems. Urban development in key trading centres reflected the economic opportunities that imperial integration created, while demonstrating the substantial investments that successful commercial expansion required. London experienced particularly dramatic growth during this period, with new residential areas, commercial districts, and administrative buildings that accommodated the increased population and commercial activity that imperial trade networks generated. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated urban planning that included improved street layouts, drainage systems, and waste management facilities that could support much larger urban populations than had previously been possible. The expansion of Winchester as a major administrative and commercial centre demonstrated the economic benefits that imperial political integration provided for regional urban development. The city's role as a royal administrative centre attracted merchants, craftsmen, and service providers who supported both governmental operations and the increased commercial activity that imperial trade networks generated. New residential areas constructed during this period featured improved building techniques and more sophisticated architectural designs that reflected the increased prosperity and cultural sophistication that imperial integration made possible. Roskilde's development as a major Danish commercial centre illustrated the urban transformation that occurred throughout Scandinavian territories, as imperial trade networks created new economic opportunities for regional populations. The city's strategic location on Zealand provided ideal access to both Baltic and North Sea shipping routes, while its role as a royal administrative centre attracted the skilled personnel and financial resources necessary for sophisticated commercial operations. Archaeological excavations reveal extensive harbour improvements, warehouse construction, and residential development that transformed Roskilde from a regional political centre into a major international trading hub. Trondheim's emergence as the primary Norwegian commercial centre within the imperial system demonstrated the economic benefits that political integration provided for previously peripheral regions. The city's location at the head of Trondheim Fjord provided access to Norwegian timber and mineral resources, while offering secure harbour facilities for vessels engaged in international trade. Royal investments in harbour infrastructure, administrative buildings, and commercial facilities created the physical foundation for commercial expansion, while imperial trade privileges and standardised commercial regulations attracted merchants from throughout northern Europe. Agricultural innovations throughout the empire reflected both the increased food production requirements created by urban growth and commercial expansion, and the technological improvements that imperial resource coordination made possible. The introduction of improved ploughing techniques, crop rotation systems, and livestock breeding programs increased agricultural productivity while reducing the labour requirements that had previously limited agricultural expansion. These innovations were particularly important in English territories where urban growth and commercial development created substantial demand for increased food production. The establishment of systematic land management systems throughout imperial territories ensured that agricultural expansion could support both growing urban populations and the military forces necessary for imperial defence. Royal surveys conducted during Cnut's reign documented existing agricultural resources and identified opportunities for expansion through land reclamation, forest clearing, and improved cultivation techniques. These surveys provided the information necessary for systematic agricultural development, while ensuring that military recruitment and taxation policies could be based on accurate assessments of regional productive capabilities. The development of specialised agricultural regions within the empire demonstrated the economic benefits that political integration and improved transportation systems could provide for regional agricultural development. English territories increasingly specialised in wool production and grain cultivation that took advantage of favourable climatic conditions and soil types. while Scandinavian regions focused on livestock raising and forest products that utilised their particular geographical advantages. This regional specialisation increased overall imperial productivity, while creating interdependencies that strengthened political unity through economic integration. The coordination of agricultural production with military requirements represented a crucial aspect of imperial land management that required sophisticated planning and resource allocation systems. The empire's military forces required substantial quantities of food, leather, and other agricultural products, while the seasonal nature of both agricultural production and military campaigns created complex logistical challenges that could only be addressed through systematic planning and coordination. The establishment of royal granaries, storage facilities, and transportation networks ensured that military forces could be supplied reliably while maintaining adequate food supplies for civilian populations. Imperial trade networks facilitated the exchange of agricultural techniques and crop varieties between different regions, leading to agricultural improvements that benefited populations throughout the empire. English agricultural innovations such as improved ploughing techniques and crop rotation systems were introduced to Scandinavian territories, while Scandinavian livestock breeding practices and forest management techniques were adopted in appropriate English regions. This technological exchange increased agricultural productivity while creating shared agricultural practices that strengthened cultural connections between different parts of the empire. The establishment of standardized weights and measures throughout imperial territories eliminated one of the most significant barriers to commercial expansion, while demonstrating the administrative sophistication that effective economic integration required. Previous commercial transactions between different regions had been complicated by the need to convert between different measurement systems, creating opportunities for fraud and dispute while increasing transaction costs that limited trade volumes. Imperial standardization created uniform measurement systems that were enforced through regular inspections and severe penalties for violations. The commercial benefits of measurement standardization extended beyond immediate transaction convenience to include improved quality control, more accurate pricing, and enhanced consumer confidence that encouraged commercial expansion. Merchants could make accurate quantity and quality comparisons between products from different regions, while consumers could be confident that standardized measurements reflected actual product quantities rather than regional variations that might disguise inferior value. These improvements in commercial reliability encouraged increased trade volumes, while protecting the reputation of imperial products in international markets. The development of commercial law throughout the empire created legal frameworks that could address the complex disputes and contractual arrangements that international commerce required, while respecting the diverse legal traditions that characterized different imperial territories. Imperial commercial codes established standardized procedures for contract enforcement, dispute resolution, and quality standards that provided legal certainty for merchants engaged in complex international transactions. These legal innovations were particularly important for high-value transactions involving luxury goods, bulk commodities, and financial instruments that required sophisticated legal protections. The integration of different regional legal traditions into coherent commercial law systems required extensive consultation with legal experts from throughout the empire, while maintaining respect for established local customs that did not conflict with imperial commercial objectives. The resulting legal synthesis created commercial law systems that combined the practical effectiveness of Scandinavian customary law with the procedural sophistication of Anglo-Saxon legal traditions and the international compatibility of continental European commercial practices. The death of Cnut the Great on November 12, 1035, at Shaftesbury marked the beginning of the most critical period in the North Sea Empire's brief but remarkable history. The king's sudden demise, possibly from illness contracted during his final campaign to secure Danish borders against German expansion, caught the imperial administration unprepared for the complex succession arrangements that his diverse territorial holdings demanded. Unlike the relatively straightforward hereditary transitions that characterized most medieval kingdoms, Cnut's empire encompassed territories with fundamentally different succession laws, political traditions, and noble expectations that made unified imperial inheritance virtually impossible to achieve. The immediate aftermath of Cnut's death revealed the structural weaknesses that had remained hidden beneath the surface of imperial unity during his lifetime. In England, where Anglo-Saxon legal traditions recognised the principle of royal election by the Witan, the succession question became entangled with broader issues of Danish versus Anglo-Saxon legitimacy that had never been fully resolved despite 2 decades of Cnut's rule. The English nobility remained divided between those who had accommodated themselves to Danish rule and those who had never abandoned hopes for the restoration of the native royal line. This division became particularly acute when news arrived that Edward and Alfred, the sons of Ethelred the Unready, who had been living in Norman exile, were preparing to assert their claims to the English throne. In Denmark, traditional succession practices emphasised the selection of the most capable adult male from the royal family, without strict primogeniture requirements that might elevate an inexperienced heir over more qualified candidates. The Danish nobility expected to play a decisive role in selecting Cnut's successor, viewing their participation in this process as a fundamental right that validated their own political authority within the kingdom. However, the Empire's English territories had provided the majority of Cnut's military resources and financial support, meaning that any Danish succession decision would need to accommodate English political realities and noble expectations. Norway presented perhaps the most complex succession challenge, as Cnut's authority there had always been more tenuous than in his other territories. The Norwegian nobility had submitted to Danish overlordship primarily because of military necessity, rather than genuine acceptance of foreign rule, and many retained sympathies for the exiled Olaf Haraldsson's young son Magnus, who had found refuge at the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kievan Rus. The prospect of a succession dispute provided Norwegian nobles with potential opportunities to reassert their independence, or at least to negotiate more favourable terms with whatever authority ultimately emerged victorious from the imperial power struggle. Harold Harefoot, Cnut's son by his first wife Ælfgifu of Northampton, possessed several advantages in the emerging succession contest that initially made him appear the most likely heir to his father's imperial authority. His mother's Anglo-Saxon origins provided him with connections to English noble families that had maintained their influence despite the Danish conquest, while his upbringing in England had given him intimate familiarity with the administrative systems and political relationships that effective governance required. Contemporary sources describe Harold as an experienced military commander who had participated in several of his father's later campaigns, demonstrating the martial competence that Scandinavian political traditions demanded from their rulers. Harold's supporters emphasised his immediate availability and his established presence in England as crucial factors that distinguished him from his half-brother Harthacnut, who was occupied with Danish affairs and could not travel to England immediately following Cnut's death. The practical considerations of imperial governance during a succession crisis favoured candidates who could assume authority quickly and decisively, particularly given the complex administrative coordination that the Empire's diverse territories required. Harold's faction argued that delayed succession decisions would create opportunities for imperial enemies to exploit the temporary power vacuum while encouraging internal rebellions that might prove impossible to suppress once they gained momentum. The political coalition that formed around Harold's candidacy reflected the complex ethnic and regional divisions that characterised English society after 2 decades of Danish rule. Many Danish settlers who had established themselves in England during and after the conquest campaigns viewed Harold as the candidate most likely to protect their interests and maintain the privileged positions they had achieved under Cnut's rule. These Danish nobles controlled substantial military resources and occupied key administrative positions throughout England, giving Harold's faction significant advantages in any immediate power struggle that might develop. However, Harold's candidacy also faced serious obstacles that became apparent as the succession crisis developed. His mother's relatively modest social origins created legitimacy problems among English nobles who expected royal wives to come from established aristocratic families with appropriate political connections and social prestige. More significantly, Ælfgifu's previous relationship with Cnut had not been formalised through Christian marriage ceremonies, raising questions about Harold's legitimacy that his opponents could exploit to undermine his succession claims. These legitimacy concerns were particularly important given the increasing influence of Christian religious authorities throughout the empire, and the growing emphasis on proper religious observances in royal ceremonies and political relationships. Harthacnut's position as Cnut's son by Emma of Normandy provided him with legitimacy advantages that his supporters argued outweighed Harold's practical political strengths. Emma's status as the widow of Ethelred the Unready and her Norman royal connections gave Harthacnut claims to represent continuity with both Anglo-Saxon and continental European royal traditions. His birth from a properly consecrated Christian marriage eliminated the legitimacy questions that complicated Harold's candidacy, while his education in both Danish and Norman courts had provided him with sophisticated understanding of European diplomatic and political practices. The Norman connection proved particularly significant as the succession crisis developed, since Duke William of Normandy's growing power and territorial ambitions made Norman support or opposition a crucial factor in determining the ultimate outcome of English political struggles. Emma's family relationships provided potential access to Norman military assistance that could prove decisive if the succession dispute escalated into armed conflict. Contemporary Norman chroniclers suggest that William was already considering intervention in the English affairs as early as 1035, viewing the succession crisis as an opportunity to extend Norman influence across the English Channel. Emma of Normandy emerged as perhaps the most influential figure in the immediate succession negotiations, as her unique position as the widow of both Ethelred and Cnut gave her unparalleled knowledge of English political conditions and noble relationships. Her survival of two major political transitions had demonstrated remarkable political acumen and adaptability, while her control of substantial financial resources and her extensive network of political contacts throughout England made her support essential for any candidate hoping to achieve stable rule. Contemporary sources describe Emma as actively participating in the negotiations that would determine England's future, using her influence to promote arrangements that would protect her own interests while ensuring political stability. Emma's support for Harthacnut over Harold reflected both maternal preference and calculated political assessment of long-term imperial prospects. She recognised that Harold's reliance on Danish settler support would likely alienate significant portions of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, whose cooperation was essential for effective governance, while his questionable legitimacy would provide ongoing opportunities for rival claimants to challenge his authority. Harthacnut's superior legal position and his potential access to Norman support offered better prospects for establishing stable rule that could withstand the various challenges that any successor to Cnut would inevitably face. The English Witan's deliberations regarding the succession revealed the fundamental tensions between different concepts of royal authority that had never been fully resolved during Cnut's reign. Anglo-Saxon political traditions emphasised the nobility's right to select kings from among qualified candidates, with considerations of personal merit, political competence, and noble consensus taking precedence over strict hereditary succession rules. However, 2 decades of Danish rule had introduced Scandinavian political concepts that placed greater emphasis on royal bloodlines and dynastic continuity, creating competing frameworks for evaluating succession claims. The Witans' initial compromise solution, which recognised Harold as regent pending Harthacnut's arrival from Denmark, reflected the political reality that immediate decisions were necessary while acknowledging the superior legitimacy claims that Harthacnut's supporters maintained. This arrangement was intended to provide temporary stability while allowing time for more comprehensive negotiations that could address the various political and legal issues that the succession crisis had raised. However, the regency arrangement created its own problems by establishing Harold in positions of authority that he could use to strengthen his political position and build support for permanent recognition as a king. Harold's actions during his regency demonstrated both his political competence and his understanding of the measures necessary to transform temporary authority into permanent rule. He moved quickly to secure control of the royal treasury and administrative apparatus, appointing supporters to key positions while removing officials whose loyalty remained questionable. His distribution of gifts and privileges to potential supporters followed traditional Scandinavian practices for building political coalitions, while his careful attention to administrative continuity reassured English nobles that governmental functions would continue operating effectively despite the succession uncertainty. The seizure of royal treasure at Winchester represented Harold's most decisive action in establishing his authority over rival claimants. The substantial silver reserves that Cnut had accumulated through taxation and tribute provided the financial resources necessary to maintain military forces, reward supporters, and fund the administrative operations that effective governance required. Harold's control of these resources gave him immediate advantages over Harthacnut, who remained dependent on Danish resources that were committed to defending Denmark's contested borders against German and Slavic pressures. Harthacnut's delayed arrival in England proved fatal to his succession prospects, as the months of uncertainty allowed Harold to consolidate his position while demonstrating his capacity for effective leadership. The practical demands of imperial governance during a period of external threats and internal instability favoured candidates who could provide immediate solutions to pressing problems, rather than those who possessed superior theoretical claims but remained absent during critical decision-making periods. Harold's successful management of administrative challenges and his effective coordination of defensive preparations against potential Norman intervention convinced many initially neutral nobles that his continued rule offered the best prospects for political stability. The murder of Alfred Aetheling in 1036 marked the most controversial episode of Harold's early reign, and demonstrated the ruthless methods he was prepared to employ to eliminate potential rivals to his authority. Alfred's arrival in England with a small Norman escort represented a direct challenge to Harold's legitimacy claims, as the young prince's status as Ethelred's son provided him with Anglo-Saxon royal bloodlines that many English nobles viewed as superior to Harold's Danish ancestry. The brutal execution of Alfred and the mutilation of his Norman companions sent clear messages to other potential claimants, while demonstrating Harold's determination to defend his position through whatever means proved necessary. The circumstances surrounding Alfred's death remain disputed among contemporary sources, with Harold's supporters claiming that the prince died during legitimate military action against an illegal invasion, while his opponents described the killing as a calculated assassination designed to eliminate a legitimate rival. Archaeological evidence from the burial site at Ely suggests that Alfred suffered extensive injuries consistent with torture before his eventual death, supporting accusations that Harold had ordered his systematic mutilation as a warning to other potential challengers. The involvement of Earl Godwin of Wessex in Alfred's capture and death created lasting political complications that would influence English politics for decades to come. The international ramifications of Alfred's murder extended far beyond immediate English political considerations, as the prince's Norman connections made his death a diplomatic crisis that threatened to involve continental European powers in English succession disputes. Duke William of Normandy's angry response to his nephew's murder provided him with justification for future intervention in English affairs, while the incident damaged Harold's reputation among European Christian rulers, who viewed the killing as a violation of fundamental principles governing the treatment of royal prisoners and political refugees. Harthacnut's eventual arrival in England in 1040 came too late to prevent Harold's consolidation of power, but the circumstances of Harold's death in March of that year created new opportunities for the legitimate heir to assert his claims. Contemporary sources attribute Harold's death to natural causes, possibly illness or injury sustained during military campaigns, but the convenient timing led to speculation about assassination that reflected the violent political atmosphere that characterised the succession period. Regardless of the specific cause, Harold's death removed the primary obstacle to Harthacnut's recognition as king, while creating new succession uncertainties about the future direction of English politics. Harthacnut's coronation in June 1040 represented the triumph of legitimist principles over practical political considerations, but his reign would demonstrate the limitations of legal claims unsupported by effective political management and military competence. His harsh taxation policies, designed to fund the Danish military forces he'd brought to England, alienated English nobles who had grown accustomed to the relatively moderate fiscal demands that Harold's government had imposed. The new king's apparent preference for Danish advisors over English nobles created resentment among the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy whose cooperation was essential for stable governance. The brutal taxation measures that Harthacnut imposed to fund his government revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of English political conditions and the delicate balance of interests that successful rule required. His demand for massive tribute payments to support Danish military forces stationed throughout England created economic hardships that affected all levels of society while generating widespread opposition to his continued rule. The popular uprising at Worcester in 1041, which resulted in the deaths of 2 royal tax collectors, demonstrated the extent of popular anger while revealing the weakness of royal authority outside areas directly controlled by Danish military forces. Harthacnut's failure to maintain control over his Scandinavian territories proved equally damaging to his imperial prospects, as Norwegian and Swedish nobles took advantage of his absence in England to reassert their independence from Danish overlordship. Magnus of Norway, the son of Olaf Haraldsson, returned from exile in Kievan Rus to claim his father's throne, with support from Norwegian nobles who had never fully accepted Danish rule. The rapid collapse of Danish authority in Norway demonstrated the fragility of imperial control that depended primarily on personal loyalty to individual rulers, rather than institutional structures that could survive political transitions. The loss of Norwegian territories represented more than a simple reduction in Harthacnut's political authority. It eliminated crucial sources of timber, iron, and other resources that had supported imperial military and commercial operations. Norwegian naval forces had provided essential support for Danish military campaigns and commercial protection, while Norwegian territorial control had secured vital trade routes connecting Scandinavian markets with Baltic and Russian trading networks. The restoration of Norwegian independence under Magnus effectively ended the economic integration that had been one of Cnut's most significant achievements. Danish territorial losses extended beyond Norway, as Slavic tribes and German nobles exploited the succession crisis to reclaim territories that Cnut had conquered or brought under Danish influence. The withdrawal of Danish military forces to support succession struggles in England left frontier regions vulnerable to attack, while the disruption of administrative systems created opportunities for local rebellions that quickly escalated beyond Danish capacity to suppress. Archaeological evidence from Danish frontier fortifications shows extensive destruction dating to this period, indicating the scale of territorial losses that accompanied the imperial fragmentation. Harthacnut's death on June 8, 1042, during a wedding feast at Lambeth, brought the Danish royal line to an abrupt end and created the opportunity for Anglo-Saxon restoration that many English nobles had hoped for since Cnut's original conquest. Contemporary accounts describe the king's sudden collapse during the festivities, with symptoms suggesting either poisoning or stroke that killed him within hours of the onset of illness. The suspicious circumstances and convenient timing of his death led to widespread speculation about assassination, though no definitive evidence of foul play was ever established. The immediate recognition of Edward the Confessor as Harthacnut's successor represented a remarkable political transformation that restored the Anglo-Saxon royal line after more than 25 years of Danish rule. Edward's selection by the English Witan demonstrated the continuing influence of Anglo-Saxon political traditions and the persistent desire among English nobles for native rule that could restore traditional governmental practices and cultural values. His long exile in Normandy had provided him with continental European political experience while preserving his status as a legitimate representative of the pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon monarchy. Edward's restoration marked the effective end of the North Sea Empire as a unified political entity, though the commercial and cultural connections that Cnut had established would continue to influence Northern European development for generations. The fragmentation of imperial territories into independent kingdoms eliminated the coordinated policies and administrative systems that had created unprecedented economic integration across the North Sea region. However, the trading networks, legal innovations, and cultural exchanges that had developed during the imperial period provided foundations for continued commercial and diplomatic relationships between the formerly unified territories. The collapse of centralised imperial authority created immediate challenges for the various successor states that emerged from the fragmentation process. England under Edward the Confessor faced the complex task of reintegrating Danish settlers and administrators into Anglo-Saxon governmental structures, while maintaining the military capabilities necessary to defend against potential invasions from Scandinavian territories. The restoration of traditional Anglo-Saxon legal codes and administrative practices required extensive negotiations with Danish nobles who had acquired substantial land holdings and political influence during the conquest period. Denmark's reversion to its pre-imperial boundaries left the kingdom significantly weakened compared to its position during Cnut's reign, as the loss of English tribute and Norwegian resources reduced the financial and military capabilities that had supported Danish expansion. The succession of Magnus of Norway to the Danish throne in 1042, following an agreement with Cnut, briefly created hopes for renewed Scandinavian unity. But Magnus's death in 1047 ended these prospects and left Denmark vulnerable to the growing power of the Holy Roman Empire and other continental European rivals. The restoration of Norwegian independence under Magnus represented a return to traditional Scandinavian political patterns, but the kingdom faced significant challenges in re-establishing the administrative and military systems that effective governance required. The years of Danish rule had disrupted traditional Norwegian political relationships, while creating new social and economic patterns that could not be easily reversed. Magnus's efforts to restore Norwegian royal authority required extensive negotiations with regional jarls, who had maintained semi-independent control over their territories during the imperial period. The fragmentation of the North Sea Empire following Cnut's death created a power vacuum that ambitious rulers throughout Scandinavia sought to exploit for their own territorial and political advantage. Magnus of Norway, having successfully reclaimed his father's throne from Danish overlordship, found himself in possession of both Norwegian and Danish crowns through his inheritance agreement with Cnut. However, this dual monarchy proved unstable from its inception, as the administrative challenges of governing two distinct kingdoms with different political traditions and competing noble factions stretched Magnus's resources beyond sustainable limits. The young king's death in 1047, possibly from injuries sustained during a campaign against Slavic raiders along the Danish frontier, eliminated the last realistic prospect for maintaining unified Scandinavian rule and opened the door for the complete dissolution of Cnut's imperial legacy. Magnus's sudden demise triggered immediate succession disputes in both Norway and Denmark that would define northern European politics for the remainder of the 11th century. In Norway, Harald Hardrada, Magnus's uncle and a veteran of Byzantine military service, moved swiftly to claim the throne despite the existence of other potential claimants within the Norwegian royal family. Harald's extensive military experience, acquired during his years as a commander in the Varangian Guard at Constantinople, provided him with tactical knowledge and leadership skills that distinguished him from his competitors. His personal wealth, accumulated through Byzantine military service and trading expeditions, enabled him to recruit supporters and finance the military campaigns necessary to secure his authority over Norwegian territories. Harald Hardrada's consolidation of Norwegian royal power demonstrated both his military competence and his understanding of the political dynamics that had enabled previous Scandinavian rulers to achieve territorial expansion. Unlike his predecessors who had relied primarily on traditional Viking raiding tactics, Harald incorporated sophisticated siege warfare techniques and disciplined infantry formations that he'd learned during his Byzantine service. Archaeological evidence from Norwegian royal sites shows extensive construction of stone fortifications during his early reign, indicating his commitment to establishing permanent defensive positions that could withstand sustained enemy attacks rather than relying solely on mobile warfare strategies. The new Norwegian king's administrative reforms reflected his exposure to Byzantine governmental practices and his recognition that effective rule required more sophisticated institutional structures than traditional Scandinavian political systems provided. Harald established permanent royal administrative centres throughout Norway, staffed with trained scribes and legal experts who could maintain consistent record-keeping and judicial procedures across his territories. These administrative innovations enabled more systematic taxation and military recruitment, while providing the bureaucratic foundation necessary for coordinating complex military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations. Harald's ambitions extended far beyond mere consolidation of Norwegian independence, as he recognised that the fragmentation of Cnut's empire created opportunities for ambitious rulers to establish new imperial structures that might rival or surpass the achievements of his predecessors. His careful study of the factors that had enabled Cnut's success, combined with his understanding of the weaknesses that had led to imperial collapse, informed his strategic planning for potential expansion into territories that had previously been united under Danish rule. The wealth and military experience he had acquired during his Byzantine service provided resources that previous Norwegian rulers had lacked, while the political instability that characterised post-imperial Northern Europe created opportunities for intervention that might not recur. In Denmark, the succession crisis following Magnus's death proved even more complex and destabilising than the Norwegian situation. Svein Estridsson, nephew of Cnut the Great, emerged as the primary claimant to the Danish throne, but his authority was contested by other members of the royal family and by regional jarls who had maintained semi-independent control over their territories during the imperial period. Svein's eventual victory in this succession struggle owed more to his political acumen and his ability to build coalitions among competing noble factions than to any overwhelming military superiority over his rivals. Svein Estridsson's early reign was dominated by his obsession with reclaiming the English territories that had been the source of his uncle's imperial power and wealth. The restoration of Edward the Confessor to the English throne represented, in Svein's view, a temporary aberration that could be corrected through determined military action and skillful exploitation of English political divisions. His extensive intelligence network, maintained through Danish merchants and settlers who remained in England after the imperial collapse, provided detailed information about English defensive preparations and political conditions that informed his strategic planning for renewed invasion attempts. The Danish king's first major expedition against England in 1069 demonstrated both his military capabilities and the fundamental changes in English defensive organisation that had occurred since Cnut's original conquest campaigns. Edward the Confessor's death in 1066 and the subsequent Norman conquest under William I had transformed English political and military structures in ways that made Danish invasion far more challenging than it had been during Ethelred's reign. The Norman military system, based on heavily armoured cavalry and sophisticated castle fortifications, presented tactical problems that traditional Scandinavian warfare methods were poorly equipped to address. The Norman conquest had also eliminated many of the political divisions and administrative weaknesses that had facilitated Cnut's success against Anglo-Saxon resistance. William's systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon nobles with Norman administrators had created a more unified and disciplined ruling class that was less susceptible to the diplomatic manipulation and bribery that had been crucial elements of Danish strategy during the original conquest period. The construction of stone castles throughout England provided defensive strongpoints that could withstand siege operations far more effectively than the wooden palisades and earthwork fortifications that had characterised Anglo-Saxon defensive systems. Svein's invasion force of 1069 represented a substantial military commitment that demonstrated his determination to reclaim English territories despite the changed political and military conditions he would encounter. Contemporary sources describe a fleet of over 200 ships carrying approximately 10,000 Danish warriors, along with siege equipment and provisions sufficient for extended operations. The expedition's composition included not only Danish forces, but also Norwegian and Swedish contingents whose participation reflected the continuing appeal of English wealth and the persistent Scandinavian belief that successful invasion remained possible despite Norman defensive improvements. The initial Danish landings along the Yorkshire coast achieved tactical surprise and demonstrated that Norman defensive arrangements remained vulnerable to well-coordinated amphibious assault operations. The Danish forces' successful capture of York, the former Jorvik that had served as the centre of Scandinavian power in northern England, provided both strategic advantages and powerful symbolic significance that encouraged further Danish recruitment while demonstrating to English populations that Norman rule was not invulnerable to Scandinavian military pressure. However, the Danish occupation of York proved temporary, as William II's rapid military response demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman military organisation and the substantial resources that the new English monarchy could mobilise for defensive operations. The Norman king's systematic devastation of Yorkshire during his campaign to expel the Danish invaders, known historically as the Harrying of the North, eliminated the agricultural and demographic foundations that had previously supported Scandinavian settlement in northern England. This brutal campaign of destruction made future Danish invasion attempts far more difficult by eliminating the local resources and population support that had been crucial to previous Scandinavian success in English territories. The failure of Sweyn's 1069 expedition revealed the fundamental changes in English political and military conditions that made restoration of Danish rule virtually impossible, despite continued Scandinavian military capabilities. The Norman conquest had not merely replaced one royal dynasty with another, it had fundamentally transformed English governmental, military and social structures in ways that eliminated the vulnerabilities that had enabled Cnut's original success. The systematic construction of castle fortifications, the introduction of heavy cavalry tactics, and the establishment of a more centralised administrative system created defensive capabilities that traditional Scandinavian warfare methods could not overcome through conventional military operations. Sweyn's subsequent invasion attempts throughout the 1070s and early 1080s demonstrated both his persistent determination to reclaim English territories and his inability to adapt Danish military methods to address the tactical challenges that Norman defensive innovations presented. Each successive expedition achieved initial tactical successes through surprise landings and rapid movement, but failed to establish permanent territorial control due to Norman military superiority in sustained combat operations and siege warfare. The pattern of Danish tactical success followed by strategic failure became increasingly predictable as Norman commanders developed effective countermeasures for Scandinavian invasion techniques. The diplomatic dimensions of Sweyn's English campaigns revealed the international isolation that limited Danish strategic options and reduced prospects for successful territorial conquest. Unlike Cnut's campaigns, which had benefited from English political divisions and the availability of Anglo-Saxon allies willing to collaborate with Danish forces, Sweyn's expeditions faced unified Norman resistance supported by continental European allies who viewed Danish expansion as a threat to broader regional stability. The papal support for Norman rule in England, based on William's promises of ecclesiastical reform and his formal recognition by Rome, provided religious legitimacy that made Danish invasion appear as attacks on Christian authority rather than legitimate dynastic claims. The economic costs of Sweyn's repeated invasion attempts placed increasing strain on Danish resources while generating diminishing returns in terms of territorial gains or tribute extraction. Each expedition required substantial investments in ship construction, equipment procurement, and warrior recruitment that depleted Danish treasury reserves without producing corresponding benefits through successful conquest or plunder. The failure to establish permanent English bases that could support future operations meant that each invasion attempt required complete logistical preparation from Danish territories, multiplying costs while reducing operational flexibility. The domestic political consequences of Sweyn's unsuccessful English campaigns created growing opposition among Danish nobles who questioned the wisdom of continued military commitments that produced no tangible benefits for Danish interests. Regional jarls, who had initially supported invasion attempts as opportunities for personal advancement and territorial acquisition, became increasingly reluctant to commit their resources to expeditions that consistently failed to achieve their stated objectives. This declining noble support limited Sweyn's ability to recruit the large military forces that a successful English invasion required, while creating internal political pressures that diverted attention from external military operations. The Battle of Fulford on September 20th, 1066, represented the final major engagement in which traditional Scandinavian military methods achieved decisive tactical success against English defensive forces. Harold Hardrada's invasion of northern England, launched in alliance with Tostig Godwinson and designed to exploit the succession crisis following Edward the Confessor's death, demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of Norwegian military organisation when applied against Anglo-Saxon rather than Norman opponents. The Norwegian victory over the combined forces of Earls Edwin and Morcar eliminated the primary English military forces in northern England while establishing Norwegian control over York and the surrounding territories. Harold's tactical deployment at Fulford reflected his sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics and his ability to adapt traditional Scandinavian warfare methods to specific tactical situations. The Norwegian forces' use of coordinated shield wall formations, supported by disciplined archery and strategic positioning along the River Ouse, created defensive advantages that neutralised English numerical superiority while maximising the effectiveness of Norwegian military training and equipment. The battle's outcome demonstrated that Scandinavian military capabilities remained formidable when properly employed against appropriate opponents under favourable tactical conditions. The strategic implications of the Norwegian victory at Fulford extended far beyond immediate territorial control, as Harold's success encouraged additional Scandinavian intervention in English affairs, while demonstrating to continental European observers that Norman conquest of England was not inevitable. The establishment of Norwegian control over northern England created the possibility of renewed Scandinavian imperial expansion that might restore the territorial unity that had characterised Cnut's empire. Harold's diplomatic overtures to other Scandinavian rulers suggested his intention to coordinate broader military action that could overwhelm English defensive capabilities through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. However, the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, marked the decisive end of Scandinavian imperial ambitions and demonstrated the military innovations that would define medieval European warfare for centuries to come. Harold Godwinson's rapid march from southern England to confront the Norwegian invasion achieved strategic surprise that caught Harold Hardrada's forces unprepared for immediate combat operations. The English king's ability to coordinate this complex military movement while maintaining operational security demonstrated administrative and logistical capabilities that exceeded traditional Scandinavian military organisation. The tactical dynamics of Stamford Bridge revealed fundamental changes in military technology and organisation that made traditional Scandinavian warfare methods increasingly obsolete against opponents who had adopted more advanced tactical systems. The English forces' use of coordinated infantry formations, supported by effective archery and disciplined cavalry operations, created combined arms capabilities that overwhelmed Norwegian defensive positions despite their advantageous terrain positioning. Harold Hardrada's death during the battle eliminated the most experienced and capable Scandinavian military commander of his generation, while demonstrating the personal risks that traditional heroic leadership styles created in evolving military environments. The symbolic significance of Harold Hardrada's death extended far beyond immediate military consequences, as his demise represented the end of the Viking Age and the traditional Scandinavian approach to territorial expansion through maritime raiding and conquest. Harold's personal career had embodied the international scope and military effectiveness that had characterised Scandinavian expansion since the 8th century, from his early participation in Norwegian civil wars through his service in the Byzantine Empire to his final attempt at English conquest. His death at Stamford Bridge marked the conclusion of an era in which individual warrior kings could achieve territorial expansion through personal military prowess and traditional Scandinavian warfare methods. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge demonstrated the fundamental transformation of Northern European political dynamics that made renewed Scandinavian imperial expansion virtually impossible. The Norwegian army's catastrophic losses, including not only Harald Hardrada, but also most of the experienced military commanders and elite warriors who had formed the core of Norwegian military capability, eliminated Norway's capacity for major overseas military operations for generations. The survivors' ignominious retreat to Norway, requiring only 24 ships to transport the remnants of an invasion force that had arrived in over 200 vessels, provided stark evidence of the magnitude of the Norwegian defeat. The internal Danish conflicts that characterised Svein Estridsson's later reign reflected the broader fragmentation of Scandinavian political unity that had been accelerated by the failures of renewed imperial expansion attempts. Regional jarls who had initially supported centralised royal authority as a means of achieving external conquest began asserting greater independence when it became apparent that royal military adventures were consuming resources without producing corresponding benefits for their territories. The gradual erosion of royal authority over peripheral Danish territories created political conditions similar to those that had characterised Scandinavia before Cnut's imperial consolidation. The emergence of local rulers asserting independence from centralised royal control represented a return to traditional Scandinavian political patterns that emphasised regional autonomy and personal loyalty relationships rather than institutional governmental structures. Archaeological evidence from Danish regional centres shows reduced investment in royal administrative buildings and military installations during the later 11th century, indicating the declining resources available for centralised governmental operations. This political fragmentation eliminated the coordinated policies and unified military command that had been essential elements of Cnut's imperial success. The loss of imperial cohesion had profound economic consequences throughout the former North Sea Empire territories, as the commercial integration that had characterised Cnut's reign gave way to renewed trade barriers and competitive relationships between independent kingdoms. The standardised currency systems, unified legal codes, and coordinated commercial policies that had facilitated unprecedented economic integration were abandoned as successor states pursued independent economic strategies that prioritised local interests over broader regional coordination. Archaeological evidence from major trading centres shows declining commercial activity and reduced construction of commercial infrastructure during the post-imperial period, reflecting the economic costs of political fragmentation. The cultural and religious changes that had begun during Cnut's reign continued to influence Northern European development, despite the collapse of imperial political structures. The Christian conversion movements that had gained momentum under imperial patronage maintained their influence through ecclesiastical institutions that transcended political boundaries, while the legal and administrative innovations that had characterised imperial governance provided models for subsequent governmental development throughout Scandinavia. However, the loss of coordinated imperial support for these cultural transformations slowed their pace and reduced their geographic scope compared to the systematic changes that had occurred during the imperial period. By 1085, the final failure of Svein Estridsson's invasion attempts and the consolidation of Norman control over England had definitively ended any realistic prospects for renewed Scandinavian imperial expansion. The military, political and economic conditions that had enabled Cnut's remarkable achievements had been fundamentally altered by the Norman conquest, the fragmentation of Scandinavian political unity, and the broader transformation of European military and governmental systems. The North Sea Empire's brief but remarkable existence remained as a historical achievement that demonstrated the potential for Northern European political integration, while illustrating the challenges that medieval imperial structures faced in maintaining unity across diverse territories and competing political traditions. The collapse of the North Sea Empire by 1085 marked not an end but a transformation, as the linguistic, legal and cultural innovations that had emerged during 3 decades of imperial unity continued to reshape Northern European society long after the political structures that had created them had dissolved. The depth of these changes became particularly evident in the evolution of the English language, where the intensive contact between Old Norse and Old English during the imperial period produced linguistic modifications that would fundamentally alter the structure and vocabulary of medieval English. Unlike the superficial borrowing that typically characterised contact between different languages, the sustained administrative cooperation and social integration that had characterised Cnut's empire created conditions for systematic grammatical influence that extended far beyond simple vocabulary adoption. The grammatical simplification that characterised Middle English development owed much to the Norse influence that had intensified during the imperial period. The complex inflectional system that had distinguished Old English began to break down in regions where Danish and Norwegian settlers had established substantial populations, particularly in the former Danelaw territories, where Norse speakers had maintained administrative and commercial prominence throughout Cnut's reign. The loss of grammatical gender distinctions, the simplification of case systems, and the adoption of Norse-derived pronouns such as they, them, and their represented fundamental structural changes that reflected the practical linguistic accommodations necessary for effective communication between speakers of related but distinct Germanic languages. The vocabulary changes that emerged from this intensive language contact extended far beyond military and maritime terminology to encompass fundamental concepts of law, government, and social organisation. Norse-derived legal terms such as law itself, husband, fellow, and outlaw entered English usage during the imperial period and remained permanently embedded in the language long after political separation had ended direct Norse influence. More significantly, the adoption of Norse administrative terminology reflected the systematic integration of Scandinavian governmental practices into English institutional structures, creating linguistic evidence of the deep administrative changes that had characterised imperial governance. The influence of imperial linguistic contact extended beyond England to affect the development of Scandinavian languages as well. Danish and Norwegian dialects spoken in regions that had maintained intensive contact with English territories during the imperial period showed increased adoption of Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, particularly in areas related to agriculture, commerce, and Christian religious practices. Archaeological evidence from runic inscriptions dating to the late 11th and early 12th centuries reveals the adoption of English-derived terms for concepts that had been introduced or systematized during the imperial period, demonstrating the bidirectional nature of linguistic influence that had characterized the empire's multilingual administrative environment. The legal legacy of the North Sea Empire proved even more enduring than its linguistic influences, as the systematic codification and integration of different legal traditions that had been necessary for imperial governance created precedents and procedures that continued to influence Northern European legal development for centuries. The concept of unified legal codes that could accommodate diverse local customs while maintaining consistent royal authority became a model for subsequent medieval kingdoms seeking to balance central control with regional autonomy. The legal innovations developed during Cnut's reign, particularly the integration of Scandinavian customary law with Anglo-Saxon legal procedures and Christian canonical requirements, provided frameworks that influenced legal development throughout medieval Scandinavia and England. The administrative practices that had been developed to govern the empire's diverse territories created institutional models that persisted long after imperial political unity had ended. The systematic record-keeping procedures, standardized taxation methods, and coordinated military organization that had been essential for imperial governance provided templates that subsequent rulers adapted to their own territorial requirements. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres throughout the former imperial territories reveals continued use of documentary systems and bureaucratic procedures that had been established during the imperial period, indicating the practical value of these innovations for effective medieval governance. The transformation of royal authority concepts that had occurred during the imperial period had profound implications for subsequent political development throughout Northern Europe. Cnut's successful integration of Scandinavian warrior king traditions with Christian concepts of divinely sanctioned monarchy created new models of royal legitimacy that influenced political thought and practice for generations. The idea that effective kingship required both martial competence and religious authority, demonstrated through successful governance of diverse populations and territories, became embedded in Scandinavian political culture and influenced the development of medieval monarchy throughout the region. The institutional structures that had been created to support imperial governance provided foundations for the development of more sophisticated administrative systems in the successor kingdoms that emerged from the empire's fragmentation. The permanent royal administrative centres, staffed bureaucracies, and systematic communication networks that had been essential for coordinating imperial policy across vast distances offered models for subsequent rulers seeking to strengthen central authority over their own territories. The techniques for managing multi-ethnic populations, coordinating diverse legal systems, and integrating different economic structures that had been developed during the imperial period provided valuable precedents for later medieval state-building efforts. The empire's role in facilitating the transition from traditional Viking Age raiding culture to medieval Christian kingship represented perhaps its most significant historical contribution. The systematic transformation of warrior bands into professional military forces serving centralized royal authority, the integration of Christian religious practices with traditional Scandinavian political ceremonies, and the development of administrative systems that could support complex territorial governance, marked fundamental changes in Northern European political organisation. These transformations occurred not through sudden revolutionary change, but through gradual adaptation and synthesis that preserved valued elements of traditional culture, while incorporating new organisational methods and ideological frameworks. The military innovations that had been developed during the imperial period, particularly the creation of professional warrior elites serving royal, rather than regional authority, influenced military organisation throughout medieval Europe. The housecarl system that had provided Cnut with mobile strategic reserves capable of rapid deployment across the empire's vast territories became a model for subsequent efforts to create professional military forces that could maintain royal authority over extensive territorial holdings. The tactical innovations that had emerged from the integration of Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon, and continental European military traditions provided foundations for the development of medieval warfare techniques that would characterize European military development for centuries. The religious transformation that had occurred during the imperial period created lasting changes in Scandinavian Christian development that extended far beyond the immediate political context of imperial governance. The systematic evangelization programs that had been supported by imperial resources, the integration of Christian religious practices with traditional cultural elements, and the development of indigenous Christian literary traditions in vernacular languages established foundations for sustained Christian cultural development throughout Scandinavia. The architectural innovations, artistic syntheses, and liturgical adaptations that had emerged during the imperial period continue to influence Scandinavian Christian culture long after the political structures that had sponsored them had disappeared. The economic integration that had characterized the empire at its height provided models and precedents for subsequent efforts at commercial coordination across Northern Europe. The standardized currency systems, unified commercial regulations, and coordinated trade policies that had facilitated unprecedented economic development during the imperial period demonstrated the benefits that political integration could provide for commercial expansion. Although the empire's political fragmentation ended systematic economic coordination, the commercial networks and trading relationships that had been established during the imperial period continued to influence Northern European economic development and provided foundations for later commercial integration efforts. The urban development that had occurred in major imperial centres created permanent changes in settlement patterns and economic organisation that persisted long after imperial political unity had ended. Cities such as London, Winchester, York, Roskilde and Trondheim had experienced substantial growth and infrastructural development during the imperial period, creating urban centres with enhanced commercial capabilities and more sophisticated administrative facilities than had previously existed in Northern Europe. The architectural innovations, harbour improvements, and residential developments that had been constructed to support imperial governance and commercial activity provided foundations for continued urban growth and economic development in the post-imperial period. The cultural synthesis that had emerged from the intensive contact between different ethnic and linguistic groups during the imperial period created new forms of artistic expression and intellectual development that influenced Northern European culture for centuries. The hybrid artistic styles that had developed through the integration of Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon, and continental European cultural traditions, the literary innovations that had emerged from multilingual court environments, and the educational developments that had been sponsored by imperial patronage established cultural foundations that continued to influence Northern European intellectual and artistic development long after the political structures that had created them had dissolved. The historical assessment of the North Sea Empire as a precursor to later medieval composite monarchies reveals its significance as an early example of the challenges and opportunities that characterised medieval efforts at multi-territorial governance. The administrative innovations, legal syntheses and cultural integrations that had been developed to govern the empire's diverse populations provided precedents and models for subsequent medieval rulers facing similar challenges of governing territories with different legal traditions, ethnic compositions, and political expectations. The empire's ultimate failure to maintain political unity demonstrated the limitations of medieval governmental systems, while its remarkable achievements during its brief existence illustrated the potential benefits that effective integration could provide. The influence of the North Sea Empire on subsequent Scandinavian political development extended far beyond immediate institutional borrowing to include fundamental changes in concepts of royal authority, territorial governance, and political legitimacy that would characterise medieval Scandinavian monarchy for generations. The idea that effective kingship required control over multiple territories and diverse populations, demonstrated through successful military conquest and administrative coordination, became embedded in Scandinavian political thought and influenced subsequent expansion efforts throughout the medieval period. The techniques for managing multi-ethnic populations and integrating different legal and cultural traditions that had been developed during the imperial period provided models for later Scandinavian rulers seeking to expand their own territorial holdings. The empire's impact on English political development proved equally significant, as the administrative innovations and governmental practices that had been introduced during the Danish period influenced English institutional development even after the restoration of Anglo-Saxon royal authority. The integration of Scandinavian legal concepts with Anglo-Saxon governmental traditions created hybrid institutional structures that persisted through subsequent political transitions and influenced the development of English medieval monarchy. The experience of foreign rule and the administrative adaptations that it had required provided English political culture with greater flexibility and sophistication in managing diverse populations and territorial holdings. The North Sea Empire's brief but remarkable existence demonstrated both the potential for medieval political integration and the fundamental challenges that such integration faced in an era of limited communication, transportation, and administrative technology. The Empire's achievements in creating unified governmental systems across vast geographical distances and diverse cultural territories represented unprecedented accomplishments in medieval European political organisation, while its ultimate fragmentation illustrated the difficulties of maintaining such integration without the institutional foundations and technological capabilities that would characterise later periods of European development. The lasting significance of the North Sea Empire lay not in its political survival, but in its demonstration that Northern European societies possessed the organisational capabilities and cultural adaptability necessary for sophisticated political integration when appropriate leadership and favourable circumstances coincided. The administrative innovations, legal syntheses, cultural transformations, and economic integrations that had characterised the empire's brief existence provided foundations and precedents that would influence Northern European development for centuries, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate political context of imperial governance to encompass fundamental changes in language, law, religion, and culture that would shape the region's historical trajectory through the remainder of the medieval period and beyond.